This conference will now be recorded.
All right. I think we're good. Morning, Charlie.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
You have your packet that I sent yesterday. There was one additional piece of information that I added into it after that I sent out, that's in your paper copies there, on the back of the option that we've already discussed. Not going to go through what we already discussed today, because I think, unless you saw something that isn't accurate or whatever, then we're just going to keep revising that as we go anyway, and we talk about stuff. So what we're going to start with will be your topic for discussion page. And we're going to come back to the table that's in here when we get to that discussion. But we have John Bowman with us here today, who is our forest conservation specialist.
And landscaping.
And landscaping, yeah. He's got a long title. So we wanted him to join us today just so he could answer your questions about types of screenings that the landscape manual offers, and then how, for example, Lehigh Quarry has, we talked about that last time in the buffer that they have. It isn't necessarily according to the landscape manual. That was something that was, there was a lot of different requirements that went into that. So we wanted John to be here first thing. So we're going to start with that so that he can go after that if he wants to. And so.
Yeah, so John, do you want to explain a little bit about the purpose behind landscape buffers, how we achieve the buffers between different types of properties, some of the tools that are employed, and then we can start looking at examples of and start talking about what everybody thinks would be appropriate for screening between residential usage and a solar facility and other types of properties and so on.
Okay, sure.
And we have some visuals to go along with that when we get to that point.
Oh, terrific. So in our county code, we have a chapter 157, which is landscape enhancement of development. So a number of years ago, we had a landscape manual, but it wasn't codified into code. And I think in 2004, the county chose to put our landscaping code together, which mandates landscaping in certain developed situations. And the intention is that we have landscaping to buffer dissimilar uses, to provide some aesthetic benefits. And the core of that really now resides in what's our landscape manual, which is a fairly short book that the chapter incorporates by reference, so that the real meat of the requirements is in our landscape manual. I think it's easiest to start by explaining that we have 4 classes of landscaping that I'll talk about initially, but then there's a few kind of extra ways of screening that you all might be interested in. But to start with the 4 classes of landscaping, the idea is what you're doing is you're looking along a property line typically, and you're saying, okay, we have maybe a commercial adjacent to residential, and perhaps we have a property line that's 100 feet long that we have to screen along. So these classes are based on the idea that we're going to screen to a certain density. That density is determined by what we call planting units. So one planting unit is one major deciduous tree. So like an oak tree, a tree that's going to get very large at maturity, would be a major deciduous tree. Or a planting unit is 2 minor deciduous trees. So something like a dogwood, which is going to stay fairly short at maturity, under 30 feet tall. 2 evergreen trees are also one planting unit. that'd be like 2 white pines, or 5 shrubs are also a planting unit. Now, shrubs, of course, can come in, shrubs that stay pretty small at maturity and, or get very large at maturity, but our landscape manual at this point actually doesn't account for that. So you simply have 5 shrubs equated to 1 planting unit. So then we take that idea and we say, okay, well, for a certain screen, we're typically going to say that we want 1 planting unit per a certain distance across that borderline. So for instance, our least dense screen is a Class D. A Class D screen is 1 planting unit per every 25 feet. And it's intended really for kind of display areas, almost like a car dealership. It's not a typical screen we see a lot. It's actually intended to show off a product. So you're trying to frame the product that you're trying to show people. A Class B is a similar idea. It's a Class B is used for parking lots adjacent to roadways. So stores want some visibility. As you're passing by along the road, we want to see that that's a Kohl's over there. So it kind of frames the view of the parking lot, but it also intends to screen the cars in the parking a little bit. So that's a 1 per planting unit per 25 feet as well. Then we get a little denser. So our Class A screen is the one that's most often used. It is for screening of non-residential uses adjacent to residential uses. And it's at a 1 planting unit per 20 feet. And at this point, we actually have a minimum width that's incorporated into the requirements as well. So it has to be at least 10 feet in width. And finally, we have a Class C screening, which is, when you look at it in the description, it says a Class C screening is to provide a buffer between single-family residences and other uses. The practicality of the way the manual applies that, the other uses are gas stations, car washes. So very intense uses are maximum screening, and that's 1 planting unit per 15 linear feet. And a minimum width of 15 feet.
With a
15 feet. The idea is you're trying to provide some separation as well and accommodate that material, because the more dense you get, and I don't know, Brenda, what schematics you had, but in the manual, there's some rough schematics in terms of just kind of an aerial view looking down on a situation like that I'm describing, and also a side view. And what you begin to see is once you get to these denser screenings, instead of just a linear row of material, they actually start to be staggered and kind of stacked against each other. And so you have a little depth to them, hence the increase in width. Those are the 4 basic classes of screening. Class A is used more abundantly than any other. I will say, I know Laura had mentioned specifically Lehigh and screening associated with that. I'll mention 2 other things that essentially can produce screening that is more robust than the screening situations I just described. One would be, there's actually a double Class A standard when you have a very heavily used road like Route 140, Route 97, adjacent to residential. Like if you have residential housing backing onto 140 or Route 97, there's a double Class A standard that is prescribed. So essentially you're taking the 1 planting unit per 20 feet and reducing it to a 1 planting unit per 10 feet.
John, when, are we talking, you can't put widths out, can you?
So I'll get to that in a minute as to what's installed at minimum sizes.
Yeah.
We do have minimum size requirements. The only other thing I'll add then, so Brenda had mentioned Lehigh, and so we do have a section about mineral mining screening specific to quarries in the code or in the landscape manual. I will say that the majority of what you see out at the Lehigh New Windsor Quarry derived from these standards. They were put together, my understanding, I wasn't involved in the process, but to provide a zone of safety, for one thing, simply because you have a use that you don't want to invite the public into. So they actually have a 70-foot buffer required for that situation. And it's also attempting to acknowledge that you're going to have some berming possibly required. So if you're creating a berm, just from the act of creating that feature and the size of it, you're going to need some additional width to accommodate that. And the mineral mining screening is different because what it's actually doing is it's actually looking at the face of the berm that's facing the roadway or the adjacent user, and it's looking at the square footage of that surface. And it's prescribing landscaping according to the square footage. So in that case, it's 1 planting unit per 200 square feet of berm surface. So you have a different kind of calculation happening. Instead of just a linear consideration, we're starting to look at, a whole surface area of a berm and the square footage that's involved.
What is the width of the berm at the Lehigh facility?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I could tell
It's
you
huge.
the height, but I don't know the width.
What is the height?
I think some of it's almost 100 feet wide at the base.
But see, they have available dirt. They want to put that dirt somewhere. So the bigger the berm, the higher the berm,
Exactly.
the wider the berm, the better off for Lehigh. So that's just apples and oranges.
It's a very different situation.
John, I've heard that planning commission discuss berming in certain situations, but is it where in your manual is it if at all ever?
So berming is mentioned in here, but I will say as was mentioned, so the berming that we typically see in a situation where we're just achieving landscaping on a residential or commercial site, you're talking a berm that's typically a couple feet high off the ground, very minimal in terms of what it's achieving in terms of height increase, maybe a number of feet wide, probably 10 at the most feet wide, something extraordinarily different from what you're seeing, like screening a quarry situation.
And I don't even think we should be talking about berming. That means moving dirt. And that means finding dirt. And that means disturbing the soil and the landscape where we don't want to do that. So I think it's just a total moot point to even talk about berm.
Well, it depends. Will they be removing topsoil to install the soil?
No, they're not. And I don't want to see disturbance out in that ag zone. It's just more erosion and more everything until that berm gets established. I've seen it. Big berms out in the quarry have gutters like that in them until they finally get them established. And when you have a gutter like that or where water runs, where's it gonna go? So, not trying to diminish what you're saying, I'm just trying to warn you that absolutely no berms out there in that exit, where you have to move dirt or haul dirt in to shield a 5 or 10 or 20 acre piece of ground. No way.
I'll just add, I had similar feedback from some members about that as well, that was just a domino issue potentially with water flow and other challenges that can be created. So there definitely was a recommendation or preference to try to avoid berms if possible. And one other thing I'll just say too, I think just generally speaking on this whole topic is the way somebody recommended thinking about it is really in terms of sort of visual barriers as sort of the end goal. And I think everyone knows that, but I think that's just a good way to kind of be thinking about it as opposed to kind of the specific landscape details. It's at the end of the day, it's a visual barrier that we're trying to accomplish.
Can you tell me how you arrived at the berms in the former code, in the existing code that we just put a moratorium on? Because berms are in that code.
But the idea was to make it sort of more natural and blend with the landscape as opposed to something you would find in a commercial area where they've got flowers and shrubs planted.
Mhm.
So, you know, if it had a berm, or if, I don't think that the way it's written, it required a berm. But I mean, the idea was that it would look like it belonged in the landscape as opposed to a miniature.
And the
think it's the
berms never
berms.
look like they belong in landscape.
I think the original code said
Keep
berms
your
required,
lipstick on that.
preferred, or.
Said a combination of landscaping and berms. I don't think berms
Or bird, I think it said, or something.
and or earth berms.
Yeah, typically we like, because every situation is going to be different, we like to provide the tools and what tools can be used. So whether it's planting material or earthen berms or whatever, we want to provide that those are, or the fencing, any of those are tools that can be used, but the requirement is to create that visual.
I'm just curious, it says to achieve this, solar develop, to achieve, to blend with the natural landscape. To achieve this, solar developers are expected to use earthen berms and native trees and shrubs to create a visual barrier. So I'm just curious how we went from that to no berms.
We're talking about the ag zone here. And the idea of keeping the ag zone as natural as possible and putting this whatever we're talking about here, these solar panels out in the ag zone. So, you know, I would fight that berm business right down the last.
But
If you wanna hide a junkyard, maybe, but,
Well, in my opinion, this equates to each other.
well, we could say that, but I still don't wanna see dirt hauled in and dirt disturbed. This is, if they can't put these things on a natural surface somewhere, on a hillside or a class 3 or whatever we decide that is the best, well, I'll fight that right down to the last core, put berms around stuff.
But Cheryl, if you feel that berms are something that's appropriate, we absolutely will note that. Yeah. Both very good points.
So currently, this would fall under Class A, a division between a residential and a non-residential?
So that's an interesting question. So currently, the way the zoning amendment was written, it didn't refer to the landscape manual at all. And our code and landscape manual don't speak to solar at all. So I think there's a real disconnect there currently. That was one of my challenges, was trying to process the plans that we had currently coming through the system, was how do I treat these? Because when you look at the language, of course, that's in the zoning amendment, it says to result in a year-round screening from the time of installation. That is a standard that none of the classes of screening in my manual actually can achieve. I would say that that is a standard that's virtually impossible to achieve. Because in the industry standard landscaping, well, let me start by saying minimum size, as you asked about. The minimum size of an evergreen tree required at installation is 5 feet. Minimum size of a shrub at installation, which might not be appropriate for solar at all, is 18 inches at installation. You're going to have a minor tree be installed at about typically maybe a 4 to 5 foot size. A major tree probably installed at about a 5 or 6 foot size. And some of that's dictated by what's in the manual, but it's also dictated by what nurseries carry. So at a typical nursery, you're not going to find something a whole lot bigger than, I mean, a 1.5 to 2 inch caliper size tree is referring to how big that trunk is. So a 2 inch caliper tree is about that big, maybe a little bigger. You're going to find stuff at a typical nursery that maybe starts to get to 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 inch caliper. So approaching 10, perhaps 12 feet in height at a maximum. But once you hit that point, they start destroying the trees to accommodate trees that they can actually sell to people, because when you get to a certain size, equipment's not large enough to move that tree. You know, the people who do the installation can't handle that tree in terms of the size of it. So there becomes a practical difficulty in installing landscaping that is excessively large. Let me say that. So to say that you want to landscape, a screening that is installed and then you immediately have year-round screening, which implies evergreen, first of all, no deciduous, but just a wall of evergreen. That is a problematic thing to try to achieve. Landscaping is
Cost, or in terms of what?
cost and practicality. If you go to a nursery and say, I want this size material, they're, you know, if it's, you're talking stuff that's really big, depending on how tall you need, they're not gonna have it. You won't be able to source the material. It would be excessively expensive to get somebody to install it.
Well, we have enough money,
I mean,
which the solar industry has. But
I guess
also there's the concern that a tree that large may not take and would die. Is that
very good
correct?
point. So yes,
That's one of my questions.
that's right. So typically when you're transplanting something that is more mature into a space, it's harder to get it to adapt and be successful in that space.
But we see smaller trees that aren't successful.
And they're not
You do.
successful because nobody's there to take care of them that first couple of weeks, which is the way they survive. You have to keep them watered, you have to put them in properly,
Yes.
get rid of the ball, do all that. And if that's not done, they're all gonna die.
Well, that was
And
my
that's why I think we see them like you saw.
And some codes, because I've spent some time looking at the other county codes, some of them require irrigation upon planting. So, you know, that's, so am I to understand that all of this was written, everything you described before solar even came into play?
That's right. So this manual's been around. We've had numerous versions since 2000. Well, since 1989, we've had different versions of landscape code, our manual. This one's from 2013. It's our most recent. It's the one we currently use. And in 2013, it didn't accommodate solar because nobody was thinking we'd have solar on the landscape.
How do you accommodate then if you're part of the, say, the site plan committee? How do you accommodate what the solar industry wants to do based on your lack of information?
Yeah, so I guess what I had done in the meantime, as we were beginning to process these solar plans, was to look and say, it seems to me that a Class A screening is appropriate because that is a residential versus non-residential use. And so that was the standard I was applying from the manual to try to put a finer point on what the developers needed to do. And nobody was pushing back against it. They were simply saying, give me a definitive, you know, what you are expecting on this plan so we can meet your requirement.
Well, and something I would point out though is that these plans then go to Planning Commission for final approval. So John he's got a manual he has to follow, and these are the bare minimum requirements. And the developer needs to indicate those on the plan. And then if they do, John approves it. But then it goes to Planning Commission, and that's where citizens can speak up and say, okay, you're proposing a Class A screening or whichever, but we feel it needs to be more robust. And we would like it to be a double Class A screening, or we want it greater density, or we want majority to be evergreens versus deciduous and so on. And the Planning Commission has the authority to then require the developer to make those changes. So the Planning Commission can force a developer to exceed the minimum requirements that John is checking for.
But why wouldn't we start with those minimum requirements?
Well, because the minimum requirements have to apply everywhere. It's not a site-by-site basis. And there may be locations where if you increase the minimum requirements, it's onerous then to that particular site. So we established the minimum requirements, and then on a site-by-site, case-by-case basis, the Planning Commission can increase that.
But we could go the other way. We could require a more robust minimum, and then if it's not necessary in certain.
Well, the difficulty there is these are codes. The Planning Commission cannot go less than what the code requires. They can increase, but they can't. So you can't say that, for example, we want to establish a Class E screening, I'll make something up, that is 100 feet wide with 20-foot evergreens and apply that everywhere. And then the planning commission come back and say, well, that's, we want to reduce that to something else. If the code were to require that, the planning commission doesn't have the latitude to decrease it. They can increase it, they can exceed the requirements, but they can't decrease it.
Okay, because I have seen that in other codes where they have a minimum requirement,
Mhm.
and then depending on maybe, there's a property that it orders that doesn't require as robust screening, then they can decrease the screening.
So that would be a variance process then,
Mhm.
yeah, that they would go through. Yeah, that would be typically by request by the developer to get a variance to code restrictions. That would be through the planning commission.
If a property owner had the location of those units were such that the property owner could put a tree bank out there, can you make that tree bank fit your codes?
So like forest banking, that you
Yes.
could sell credit and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I would say that for forest banking purposes, what we're trying to establish is a forested situation that has some habitat value.
Right.
Having something fairly narrow and linear,
That's what I mean, it'd have to be wide.
It would have to be wide.
The property would have to allow.
so I'm not saying you couldn't do it, it would have to be very wide to allow for that, because we wouldn't see it as a resource benefit until it got some substantial width, probably at least 50 feet.
Well, see, it's kind of double dipping anyway.
And the other thing too is I will say for reforestation, our typical reforestation type sites, you're not planting very large material, you're planting, very small stuff.
What's the oversight to make sure replantings are done properly? When is it checked off?
Yeah, so under our current system, there's a 2 inspection protocol. So there's an initial inspection to essentially, once a plan's approved and it's implemented, I do an initial inspection to make sure that everything has been planted where it belongs, to the number and the species that were, on the plan. And if that initial inspection is satisfactory, then there was a 1-year follow-up to be sure that everything is still alive.
Wow.
So any material that's dead at that time at the 1-year inspection has to be replaced.
But if, let's say, 5 years down the road, there are materials that are dead, they could contact zoning and say they're in violation.
You need to drive around.
So technically, it is a zoning violation if you have landscape material that is dead after that 1-year period. We don't look at it after that 1-year period unless a complaint is made.
Like, let's say something happens and the whole line dies.
Yeah.
Then someone could call zoning and say, this needs to be looked
And they refer it to me. Yes.
at. Right, right.
That's not a good maintenance plan.
Yeah,
I
we
think
would
we've
be the
talked about
enforcement
that.
authority and we would recommend, like you say, to Jonathan, figure out what needs to be fixed. And if they didn't fix it, then we're talking going to court and penalties.
Right, so there is a mechanism for enforcement. So would you recommend if we had to put a class in the current zoning, the text amendment for solar, would you recommend it would be class A as a starting point?
It's a very good and difficult question. I think the difficulty is trying to wrestle with the language you currently have, which talks about the establishment of a year-round screening and installation versus what the manual can achieve.
And that as we currently have can be completely,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, we're basically starting from scratch in this discussion.
If you're starting from scratch, I mean,
Yeah.
I think the way the manual's set up, it would be appropriate to use a Class A. However, a Class A is not as dense probably as some folks who have an attitude of, we don't want to see it, and we don't want to see it at any point in time. A Class A or none of the screenings in this manual are achieved.
Maybe.
And so is one planting unit, you have 2 white pines, so what other evergreen planting?
Yeah, so, when you drive around and look at landscape screening, mostly you're going to see arborvitae and Leland cypress. They're used the majority of the time when screening is trying to be achieved from an evergreen standpoint. That's part of the difficulty too. Our evergreen palette in the mid-Atlantic is really small, actually. We only have a handful of trees that are evergreens that grow larger, that are, fairly successful in this area. So one of the standards you try to hit is species diversity. You don't want to have a monoculture in just one line of many of the same species. But it becomes difficult to incorporate a lot of variety, especially in the evergreen area, because we've got, just a handful.
Have you used the green giant at all in your landscape?
Green giants, I see more than anything else. They're like the number one thing that's typically put on a plan.
And some cedars maybe? They're
Occasionally, they're not very favored. They tend to have some, they tend not to stick to a really nice kind of habit, I guess, in terms of structure. And sometimes they have issues with disease and things. Yeah.
How do you feel about the perimeter, entire perimeter screening in terms of what you've been talking about? I've seen a lot of the site plans and they don't ever do that entire perimeter. If we were to request that the entire perimeter be covered.
So I guess I've been bemused by one or two things. One was an interaction with someone who they had a stand of forest, existing forest between their property and the proposed solar site. And they wanted additional screening on top of that. I was very surprised by that because in my mind, if you have existing forest, that's one of the best screenings you're going to possibly achieve between a site and
It's not evergreen. I mean,
correct. That was their issue.
Screening 6 months of the year,
So,
depending on the density.
Yeah, I don't know that. I guess it's difficult for me to give my opinion because I don't think that, in my opinion, that these facilities need to be screened to the extent that some other folks feel like they.
I think it's also site dependent.
Certainly.
So, for example, in our site, there's one part that backs to existing trees, and there's no residences in view of that. So it wouldn't be appropriate, I don't think, to have to screen that.
I mean, I will say though, everything is site specific. I will say that one thing I was doing as we started to get into this was there were occasions where the developer would have the proposed screening hugging the edge of the solar field itself. And lots of times, depending on how the neighbors were sitting, they were up above and had kind of a higher aspect and were looking down on the site. The proposed screening wasn't going to do anything for them. So I was encouraging developers to move it to the border of the properties where we could. So it was, sitting higher in the landscape and providing more immediate screening. That's extremely helpful. There's been a few cases, and I think, which one are you, Jason?
Project Sunshine on St. Dorsey Road.
Okay, because there's one on Deer Park. I forget what the name of that one was. but-
Nora Valley.
So the Nora Valley one has some users across the street who literally are looking down on the site. That's probably the most difficult situation because even with substantial berming perhaps and trees that are larger and going to grow, I mean, you're going to have a view of that site for just because of the aspect of how you sit in certain cases. Yeah, I'm not sure how you overcome that.
Yeah, you came out to my property, if you
Okay.
remember, and we walked. So I have a standard.
You were on the side though, so you were at least at the same level as the sites, right? Pretty much.
Well, I mean, that property does,
Yeah, it's kind of a rolling.
it's rolling, and then we have a second story elevated deck. So, yeah, I mean, it's, that's where the berming comes in, I think, to help with some of that screening. But I don't see anything here that currently exists that would provide, and that's the one thing I did agree with in the former text amendment was that it was, screened from day one from view, whatever wording they used in there. So that is one thing I agree with. So maybe that means that we need to add another classification to the landscape manual.
I mean, I guess something that, just to frame perspective on this, the Class A screening would be applied to the situation where you had a residential home adjacent to a warehouse. or adjacent to an industrial facility, something of that nature. Not to say that that Class A screen is going to immediately screen that use or provide, an immediate lack of being able to see that facility. But the idea with the Class A was that eventually that material would grow into a screen that was dense enough to provide no visual, no ability to see that adjacent use.
Eventually. That's a very broad term.
It's a kind of.
So year-round screening from time of installation, I think, is key. And I know, you're not seeing it from, we have different opinions on whether or not you should be able to see it. I understand that. But from my perspective and the hundreds of people that we represent, we don't want to see it, and we do equate it to a metal and glass junkyard. So I don't think A is sufficient. I don't know why, you wouldn't immediately go to C, which is residential and other uses, with a more depth to it and 1 unit per 15 feet. But even that, I don't think would provide the type of screening that we're looking for.
I would agree with you. I mean, my rationale at the time of not applying to Class C was that, a gas station, a car wash, you have noise, you have users coming in and out, all this activity. Certainly a solar site's not going to generate a similar type of activity threshold, I guess. There's a real practical difficulty this group has in trying to, if the target is year-round landscaping and installation, which I'm not saying it is, because I understand that language went away, but if that's the intention of some folks, that's a virtually impossible mark to hit. So I guess I just want to.
And that same mark is not
Communicate that.
required for any other type
It's
of
not.
landscaping in the county.
So I'm going to go back to the site plans for a minute, which is a really great mechanism we have for communicating with the developer that submits the plans, right? So the engineer and developer is submitting the site plan. And as Chris pointed out, the Planning Commission can and does look at these on a case by case, right? They're seeing each and every one of them and they're offering feedback, and they do look at what people are saying, how adjoiners are situated, what the specific site has in store. And we can and do see the Planning Commission either say, yeah, you need to do a better job with the landscaping at that property line, or sometimes the developer comes in with a plan that exceeds the minimum requirements. We see that they're already doing that and offering that, right? So anything that gets then approved, and I think this is an important thing to note too, because we talked about the inspection that happens and when that happens. So any landscaping on that plan, that approved plan, is then bonded as well. So even if it exceeds the minimum, they have to bond all of that to ensure that it's put in place and it stays as is. So I just think that's an important thing to note, that the Planning Commission does speak to that. The other thing that we can do as staff, and we have done in a lot of scenarios, is say, show me what that looks like. Show me an elevation of that landscaping. Show me, if I'm driving and approaching this site, what that looks like. There's so many tools available to the industry to create like 3D renderings that we see that. We see them taking that, what that viewscape looks like, and putting that landscaping into place so you can actually see what it will look like, right? And require, I've seen cross sections done in the drawings where it says, here's your visual from this standpoint, here's a cross section of what that looks like. So there are quite a few things that we can continue to say, when the Planning Commission sees this, they will benefit from seeing it from this perspective, right? From this vantage point, you have to show them what that looks like.
If I could, Westminster Solar, we had them do that it's an industrial solar panel, so it's not in this discussion, but it's on Route 97, so we were concerned about people on Route 97 and glare and all that, so we had them do a view shed there. And also, as far as planning commission being able to designate additional landscaping, I would say it's probably one of the most common comments that they had. And one of the main reasons they take it back for final review to the planning commission. In fact, I have something scheduled for this month for planning commission that they required additional landscaping. That's basically the whole reason this is going back to the planning commission, to make sure they did it right. So I'd say it's one of the more common things that the planning commission has on their mind. when they're looking at
Show
plans.
that website. I'm not sorry, not the website. Can we show the photos?
Your photos?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Kirsten, but I think at that point it's subjective. You know, I think that we need to have requirements.
As much as every site is specific, though, right? It is, we try to put it in place to try to like blanket cover. This is the minimum for every single property that this could be applied to, right?
Yeah.
But each site is so specific, and that's what we have to keep in mind.
So this is a solar farm in Baltimore County, and this is the view as you approach from Oakland Road in Freeland. And it does have landscaping around it. I know it's not, we can't zoom in any further, so it's maybe a little difficult, but if you go to the next photo, this is the screening that they planted, and you can see right through it. You can see that some of the trees are dead already, they're dying. It's, you know, there may as well be nothing there. And then we get closer even, you know, this is what we're trying to avoid. You know, having this litter Carroll County, and it is just an eyesore. Can you go one more? Yeah, so this is near the entrance to the facility, and this company, I think it's called Clear Energy or Clean. They're a founding member of Charlie's organization. I know there are many, many solar companies in that coalition, but this is one of the founding members, and this is what they're providing for screening. So I think one more is the road that goes into there. I mean, this is just disgraceful, in my opinion. I do not want to see this in our county.
We do not want to see it.
Mhm.
And then anybody sitting
I
at the
drive
table
by,
wants
I
to
drive
see
by
that.
an industrial solar on the Wakefield Valley Road and 31 every day. There's no screening except a chain link fence. Nothing, except the farm planted some grass around it so you can make hay off it, carry it around it. There's no screening at all.
What
So
size trees?
how did that happen?
Yeah, how did that happen? And what size trees, if you need to go back? I know there are some, you know, I guess these are the evergreens that died, and then there are some deciduous. But what size tree would you say that is right here?
I mean, judging from the stakes that are
Mhm.
put in next to it, it's probably 5 or 6 foot tree.
Yeah, this is what we're trying to avoid. And I know I say I, but, you know, we're representing large numbers of people. And, you know, we love Carroll County. We want to see it stay a farming community, and that we can't say this enough. And to us, this is not agriculture. This is not farming.
So the
I
one
think you
question,
could have, I mean, couldn't we have, to the point of sort of the bonding requirement, can it be specified that like the trees will be ensured to, you know, meet a sustained, self-sustained growth within 10 years or something, and they'll be replaced if they die? I mean, I think there's like some safeguards for something like that. And the other point, which I know I keep pounding on this, but we could say it's, you know, 0.1% of the entire ag zone in the entire county could be community solar and nothing else. So it's not like it's not going to be a county that's just, as you say, like littered with solar panels. This is a tiny fraction, and it's an opportunity for some landowners to use their land in a way that maybe is more economic than agriculture. So I think there needs to be some kind of reasonable compromise in understanding that while you represent maybe 100 folks, the county's got 170,000 people. There's a lot of other interests out there that are being balanced. This is an economic opportunity such as agriculture. It's a different way to make money, but we're also saying that like it's a tiny percent, 0.1% of the ag zone land that could go to community solar. So I think we need to kind of maintain perspective on that. But I do think just from the visual barrier standpoint, there can be some assurance there, maybe within the bonding requirement that, you can't just plant the trees and then walk away. Like that sustained growth has to be maintained. If the trees die, they have to be replaced. You can have those kind of parameters in there. I just want to try to keep it, we got to be reasonable here. There's a balance, that has to be struck.
I understand all your talking points, and some of them make sense, but I have a question. We have a chart here of all the solar projects that are either under review and it says solar acreage, 20 acres. Solar acreage, 16 acres, 12 acres. Is that just solar panels? So if you start adding screening, so that's everything.
Everything.
So that would be the screening, the berms, the whole nine yards.
transformers.
Okay. So if we go, so then each project would be different compared to how much acreage you need for all the screening and everything. Is that, I just want to get that on the table. Okay.
And in terms of proliferation, there's 8 from May until, and actually the site plan started before May. So we're into year 2 and there's 8 community solars. And I would like,
We're being invaded, there's no question about
and
that.
when you add the industrial on ag remainders,
There are others on commercial.
I know
so
that.
it's
I see them
gonna
every day.
multiply. And I actually think some figures on that. The new solar project installed every 60 seconds in 2021. Solar expected to quadruple in size between 2022 and 2030. At least 11 states have passed regulations related to solar panel waste. Well, that was about waste. But that's a lot of projects. And we're just another county that's going to get the same as everybody else.
Yeah, I don't
Unless
know
we put enough
anybody that hasn't
restrictions.
gotten some sort of a brochure or we're gonna make you rich, but I mean, all this stuff, we just get it. I have a farm under easement and I get it every day.
And I do too, and I only have to.
I mean, they're coming in like flies.
The other side of that is that the state is requiring that, is it 50% by 2030? Or I saw something about
No, that's-
100% of renewable sources. I think it's 17%, which need to be solar.
I'm
So
tired
the
of being-
state
Put them on
is-
every roof in the
That's right,
neighborhood.
give it
Put them on
to
all the
them.
roofs.
But if the state is requiring that and Carroll County is resisting it, the concern is the state's gonna override the county. And so the county has to put in place something that's reasonable, that meets everyone's requirements, so that we're not mandated by the state to do something nobody wants.
Yeah, I
And
understand.
this is a fine line here.
I
We're
understand
here-
we have to play in the sandbox together. I get that. I've been around that long enough. I think our concern, quite frankly, is you could say 0.1% or something like that. Our concern is what happens in the future. And that is the big rub. Quite frankly, if you said thou shalt never, ever, ever do any more than this, I think you'd get this group together pretty quick. But quite frankly, none of us believe it. And I wonder who's going to super. I keep teasing Annette that she's got to drive over the county every day. Who's going to supervise this thing?
That's a thing you're going to hear a lot from me today. It's the management, it's the quality management. You can't plant a tree, let it sit there and expect it to live for a year when you're going to go back and take a look at it.
This is for
That
Chris.
is not going to work.
This is for Chris. I think if you ask, I'm pro farm all the way in agriculture, all that, but I'm also, a lot of people who, I saw our farms developed also. I also know a lot of people who moved to this county because they like the view. I don't know how you put a price on it. I think the biggest issue is the limit, and then I think we get ourselves back to the table. But no one trusts.
I just want to,
I don't know how you get around that.
Well, that's one thing about set the limit today with politicians and everything. It could change next year.
That's right.
So everything could be different next year.
well, we're all
Well,
looking
that's
for
why we're
today.
here.
That's
There
what
was
I'm
a
saying.
zoning text amendment that was approved and in place for over 18 months, and then we had an election, and now it's all changing.
Not because of the election, it started before the election.
Well,
I just
but
want to
it
make
was
that point clear.
approved under the last Board of Commissioners,
Correct.
and now we have a new board with.
Well,
four
we
new
also have a
commissioners.
new state.
During
with a
COVID
new state.
And lockdown.
Here,
So
and
no
to
one
wrap
was
up, my part to wrap it up. Yeah, we got a new state thing. We want to play in the sandbox, not play the thing. But until these things can support themselves without government money, I have questions of what's going to
This
change.
project is not asking for any money from Carroll County.
No, not from county.
No,
No, I'm talking about tax credits. I'm talking about
that's
issues such
a
as that.
different issue than
It is
what
a
we're
different
discussing
issue,
here
yeah.
today.
But
That's a
it
completely
is
different
an
issue.
issue. What I'm getting at is,
You're talking
when
about
the
government.
economics, the true economics drive the development, I get it. But when you have public money involved, then I don't know what's the future. It could be good, it could be bad.
I would like to say that I understand we need to play in the sandbox. I mean, we're here playing in the sandbox.
Yes.
We don't believe that it should be on agriculture at all.
Yep.
We think that community solar projects should be on commercial. They are commercial operations. They belong on commercial property. Put them on
I
rooftops.
understand that, but you gotta
Put them
remember one
on,
thing.
on places that there's other, locations that people are putting on roofs, on parking lots, on,
And
other.
that's true, but you gotta remember one thing about commercial land also. A lot of the commercial land in Carroll County right now, that's not being used for anything. It's being farmed. So that farmland's gonna be lost if you put it on commercial land too.
But we know that.
Yeah, but we know
But-
the zoning, and we know the zoning's there. We're talking about changing something here. We're talking about not having stuff on ag land, so we're adding one more thing to the list of, that's as long as my arm, that should be looked at, by the way, by somebody, some planning commission, to see if any of these long lists of what ifs on ag remainders should stay on ag remainders. That's number one. Number two, now we're adding one more thing on ag remainders. So instead of looking at it and saying, is this appropriate or is it not appropriate? We're just here to say, should we add one more thing?
But
And that's what
And it's
disturbs
a
me.
commercial, I'll finish my thought before Jay interrupted me. I was trying to say that, so we are playing the sandbox. We don't agree it should be on ag at all. And, it is a commercial operation. So to say that a class A, 1 unit every 20 feet, that's just not acceptable.
So that's.
can I make one comment, please? That solar text amendment allowed use on ag remainders. And whether or not people were paying attention or not, it went through the county process. There was public reviews, there was public hearings, and it was put in place. So now there's a list that includes solar for ag remainders. And in good faith, people like myself went into agreements with solar companies. Solar companies spent thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on engineering these sites to meet the requirements. And money and time and effort was invested. And now, and no, it's not. And now the county is pulling that away with the stroke of a pen because some small portion of the population objects to it. My point is, in terms of property rights, what other things will they pull away? So if you look at that whole list of things that are allowed on ag remainder properties and you say, well, I don't like any of them, what does that do to the price of my ag remainder property? And what then am I allowed to do with it?
Yeah.
I bought this piece of property knowing it was zoned this way, just like you bought your property knowing it was ag. If that is changed, what does that mean for the property owner and property rights of people in this county?
It's
And
not
that's
just
the bottom
one
line here,
small
is property rights.
portion of the population. And it's not just this county either. I mean, if you do your
understand that.
research, it's all across the
I
board.
understand that,
People
but
do not,
you cannot
citizens do not
compare
want to
ag
see
solar
this.
to 750
I'm gonna call
acres
time out.
out in Iowa. You cannot.
Good discussion, and I think we've talked over the past couple work group sessions that we know where everybody's opinion is in general on it. And we're absolutely documenting everybody's opinions on where solar is allowed and so on. So, but we have to move forward as far as a discussion as under the premise that it is allowed on agricultural properties. And we are absolutely going to be talking with the commissioners that there is a desire that it not be allowed on ag. And we're not ignoring that in the slightest, right? However, with the premise that it is allowed on ag, what we're talking about now is what's an appropriate screening. And so what I'd like to hear from Cheryl and that what your thoughts are on what you feel would be an appropriate screening on these types of properties. And we've got Jonathan here who can kind of dial that into what is feasible. So if you want to propose that 50-foot evergreens are what you want to see, we'll document that that's your opinion, but just understand the reality is it's not feasible. So if we can, I don't know if we'll be able to
That's
get
one
there.
more question.
Yeah, just 1 second. If ideally, if we could dial into something that you feel is acceptable and Jonathan indicates is feasible, that would be a wonderful place to be. I don't know if we'll get there,
Mhm.
but if we could try and discuss into and move into that. So you want to say one thing and then Laura wanted to say something and then maybe we can.
I was just wondering from Jonathan, if you can tell from one of these photos, the depth of this buffer and the width between the trees, what that would be, and what that would equate to in our current landscape manual. Maybe go back one more,
You can hit the little thing next to the arrow.
How many
and
rows
make
are
it
in
bigger.
Yeah, you might
Well,
make it bigger. There you go.
I mean, it's fairly deep, I would say. It looks like you have a fair amount of space. So
At
those,
least
those
100 feet.
the stakes that you see are probably about 4 foot tall from the ground to the top of those stakes.
So the trees
So-
maybe 5 feet.
Yeah, and so think about the distance between the trees with that perspective as well, so, but depth wise, I mean, you're at least, I'd say, what, maybe 30 feet, maybe well beyond that possibly. It's kind of hard for me to tell.
Mhm.
And those people all fill in as they grow up, I think, right, with the.
And how long before, if they survive, how long before you think it would provide any?
I mean, if the threshold for screening that you're thinking of is not being able to see that facility through there, you're talking many years before that material fills out to the extent that you're not seeing.
So is that, the one that was dead, is that a cedar?
Yeah. it does
That's a
look like
cedar,
that's
and then one back, I think there was some type of spruce in between there that,
Yeah, in the middle.
that's not a white pine, it looks like some kind of spruce.
Perhaps, so that could be a legal site. That's true.
Okay,
Perhaps, too.
or arbor.
It looks like, yeah, I think the eastern red cedar is what you see browned up there.
Okay. Yeah, so what would you equate that to, what our current?
In terms of the class of screening?
Mhm.
That's very different from the linear type of screenings I was describing. You have a lot of depth there. You probably have a lot more plant material in this case than you would in the typical screenings that I was talking about, even the class C and the class A, which are most dense. The idea is that you're putting those plants in a more linear fashion altogether. You might be staggering them a bit, but you have a 10-foot width or a 15-foot width that you're putting all that material in. So instead of where this is kind of scattered across a much deeper area, you're kind of eliminating your we call it opacity, when you can't, something that's extremely opaque, you can't see through it.
Would you convert that to square footage?
So, yeah, I guess in this case, you're almost eliminating your opacity a bit because you're spreading it across such a depth of area. Whereas if you took all that material and you squeezed it to within 15 feet of each other, it would be very much more opaque and very much more dense.
You know, the,
Jonathan, I got a question for you. In your opinion, if they added an opaque fence behind that screening, how would that affect? Put slats in the chain link fence?
Right, so that is another way to achieve a visual screening. Now, whether somebody wants to be seeing a fence versus a solar panel, I don't know.
Well, I'm saying a combination of the two.
You could do that.
Yeah,
The height is probably an issue, maybe, perhaps.
Like I said, or an opaque fence behind it or something.
Yeah, we have a reference. Typically, for us, fencing is utilized in a variance type of situation where you might have a situation where somebody is unsatisfied with the screening that vegetation can provide. So a block wall or a fence will be incorporated at that point to try to go above and beyond. And we have a reference to a 6-foot high fence in here. It's not that you can't be higher than that, but that was kind of our basic standard height of fence used for screening.
some of the counties that we've been looking at are talking about a 70 to 80% opacity,
Okay,
opaqueness, which includes events, which we're gonna do as part of the buffer. So, the height of the fence plus 2 feet above for the height of the tree. How does that sound? If the fence is 7 feet, then we'll start with a 9-foot tree
So,
plus the fence.
yeah, so at the point that you get into a 9-foot tree,
Mhm.
it's pretty big, you're starting to move out of maybe what would commonly be installed in terms of
Mhm.
plant material.
But it has a much more already planted look, a better view overall.
And if it's maintained,
And if it's maintained,
then it has.
and there's a mechanism by which there is reporting done and oversight by the landowner or whoever. The solar facility is out of there. We know that. It's done, they're gone. They screen by remote. Charlie's done it with us, so this is true. They do their oversight by remote. That was an answer to a question that I asked the Chalberton representative. They don't even see. If anything gets reported, they take a pickup truck in there and do something about it. So that's, you have to start with something good and then maintain it. So that's the only way it's gonna ever pass muster.
So you're recommending a 7-foot fence and then 9-foot?
Is that the
The
standard?
standard is for the electrical requirement.
Right. So that's got some okayness to it.
Can we take a moment? I did, that sounded like a great idea to me last week when we met, the screening of the fences. And then I took a few minutes and I looked at what they look like.
Really?
And yeah, so I have some pictures. Can I share those?
I don't, you'd have to,
I can turn this around and everybody can see it.
okay, the only thing is
Yeah.
that if anybody watches this later, they wouldn't be able to see it.
Can I email them to you?
Yeah, if you email them to me, I can pull them up.
You can email to right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me do that.
While she's doing it, can I ask my two questions?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Annette was saying you have apprehensions about
It's
these
feet
trees.
inch.
If they're not maintained properly, they won't make it a year, right? So you go out after a year and do inspections. What is the general success rate of what you see after a year? Like, we should know that. We should be able to put some quantitative measures to that.
General success rate for landscaping that I look at, I would say, oh gosh, probably 10% of it maybe.
Doesn't make it.
Doesn't make it.
Correct.
But you have somebody who has a vested interest in maintaining that, correct?
Well, so at the 1 year inspection, anything dead needs replaced. It's 100%.
Absolutely.
It all needs to be 100% living at that inspection. If it's not, it needs replaced. There's so the developer is landscape contractor. Typically, most landscape contracts are such that there's a 1 year guarantee. So whoever's doing that initial installation of that material is on the hook to see that it's alive after 1 year, just per the typical contract that landscape contractors do with the developer. So it fits very well, provided that the inspections are being requested and happening on that initial and 1 year mark.
But an industrial developer or a commercial developer has a vested interest in making that visual thing pleasant to the person or the customer that they want to come in. So this does not happen because there's no one there except us that live there and the landowner.
But in a lot of cases, the developer they're not on site, right? Like a storage building. They're not on site.
No, they're not.
Right? Yeah.
But there are people that are on site that have to be.
Or like an auto store, right? Whoever developed that is not who is on site, and whoever's on site is more interested in the business than the landscaping. So I think it's the check, it comes from,
Well, then you could
inspection.
You could equate that person with the landowner, which is what we're saying. If the landowner has to be responsible, then the landowner would be the owner of the establishment. That's their building, that's what they own, that's where they're making their living. So they want it to look appealing and be appealing. It makes common sense. You can do that equation from one to the other very easily.
That
Good
depends on the type
concept.
of development. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
Right.
it does,
Okay.
it does.
John, what happens if it is dead at 1 year? Do you restart that 1 year inspection sequence?
No, it gets replaced, and then once I visually inspect again and see that it's all alive, we sign off on the 1 year.
So you don't get that another year to make sure it goes up, right?
It's really a matter of resources. We have one individual who's both the landscape and forest conservation specialist. And so proactively going out and looking at doing these inspections is a drain on our one resource. So that's where it becomes a reactive, that if there's an issue and any citizen files a complaint, then it goes to Jay. We identify the issue, then Jonathan can go out and specifically look at it. It's resources.
Supposing we make a better plan that says it's a shared responsibility between the landowner and the developer, the solar energy people, that they are responsible for maintaining all of this. And
But there is a landscape
they have
maintenance
a
agreement.
system by which they're required to do the oversight and report it to you. And if it doesn't meet your muster, then you send one of your inspectors out.
And I don't know what you're getting at, but there is
now?
a landscape maintenance agreement that, as part of the public works agreement process, any developer has to sign. So that landscape maintenance agreement, which if you guys needed to review it, I can provide copies of what that is. But essentially, it's an assurance that the developer / owner, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, have an agreement to establish that material within a certain period of time and then maintain it. And the one thing I will point out, so bonding used to be set up where we held the bond until the 1 year inspection. A number of years ago, the commissioners actually directed us to release the bond after the initial inspection was satisfactory. So for landscaping, we actually released the bond after the initial inspection. Now, I haven't seen a lot of compliance issues where I've come back at the 1 year, seen problems and had people resist replanting. I haven't seen a lot of that, so it hasn't really become a problem. But at the 1 year inspection, we currently do not have bond money being held to compel folks to replant.
So Queen Anne County requires 2 staggered rows of evergreens with 3-foot berms. So the plantings have to be at least 6 feet in height, and then the berms elevate them to 9 feet in height. And it needs to be opaque within 3 years.
Nice.
You said okay within 3 years?
Okay.
Okay within 3 years.
Is that a noxious weed?
They'll fix it right away.
My other question is for Charlie. So Charlie, so if we, if there's a plot of land and there's going to be houses on it, we don't necessarily know what those houses are going to look like. If they came in on an ag remaining portion and someone proposed a church or a school, right? There's not anything that specifically would conjure up in someone's head as to what that looks like. If we're talking about aesthetics, right? But solar, everybody's mind immediately, like the pictures that were just shown, right? That's what we go to. Now, the solar industry has been around for quite a while, and you are well aware that not everybody likes the looks of your product. So are there variations on a theme, Charlie? Like, have you developed solar panels that have different aesthetics to them? And I'm asking because, as silly as it sounds, like we have a cell tower in Carroll County that is a giant cross, if I'm not mistaken, right? So they have taken that and said, well, we'll evolve it into something that may be aesthetically pleasing. So is the industry itself working in that direction? Are there options? Are there variations on a theme?
It's a good question. I'm not familiar with kind of the at least like a change in sort of the technology physically to look more aesthetic itself, like the solar panels and the arrays that they're built on. So I'm not aware of an attempt to do that. I think to date, it's boiled down to these kind of meetings where there's different opinions on kind of what is reasonable or not, and just trying to figure out what the right balance is regarding fencing and visual barriers and setbacks and all of that. It's a little bit different, I think, in each state, obviously different in each county. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's something that we face elsewhere. CCSA as a trade organization, like we're becoming more involved in these discussions, but generally speaking, from a resource standpoint, we're mostly hover at the kind of state level regulatory legislative work. And slowly now we're getting more involved in counties also. So I admittedly don't have, I haven't gotten in the weeds as much as the developers themselves have. But to my knowledge, there's not kind of a change in the actual technology itself to, look different.
That would be an interesting pursuit. I encourage you to take that to a higher level, right? Not everybody wants the same looking car, not everybody wants the same looking church, not everybody wants the same looking solar panel. So I think you can do it, Charlie. Work on it.
But we know an idea. Solar panels that look like houses.
There are solar panels,
House, I like it.
yeah, there are solar panels more west that are now like, 12-foot high, 20-foot high buildings, completely solarized instead of windows. Ask
That's a different
Commissioner
type,
Geary,
is what
but
I-
however, that's another type. You were talking about different.
And I was just gonna
types.
say, if you put them
There
in
was
the
a
right
lot of
place,
innovation.
but different size, we're talking about 2 megawatts,
Absolutely.
those are
Absolutely.
much.
But
But even with these, if they're placed in the right location, the screening issue goes away.
Yep,
So
no,
where
understood.
they are.
Just it's a two-sided street, right? Like we could do as much green as possible, but the solar people,
Yeah.
come on, develop your product. You got this.
So Patty, you want to show
Sure,
your-
so
your
I
pictures?
was, I like that idea of having the opaque fencing that we talked about last week. So this is called agricultural fencing, which is the company that we're working with. This is what they've proposed to us, is a wooden post with this type of wire. And
it's like
there's been a lot
that's-
of,
that's
right.
technically
So if you
a
go,
fence.
it's not opaque. If you go to the next picture, the next file. Yeah, there you go. So this is considered opaque fencing from a fencing company.
It's
And then
like
it comes-
burlap.
Plastic
A
fiber,
plastic,
and it
yeah.
comes in this color, it comes in green, it comes in black. But to me, this looks like a secret government facility, and I don't know if that's any better than looking at solar personally. And if you go to the next picture, these are the slats in the chain link fence, which I believe are some type of plastic. And to me, that doesn't look very good. It looks like a town pool if you're wanting to screen the bathers. And I know that those slats also get broken and chipped and fade. So I like the idea of the opaque.
Well, like I say, it's
screening.
not, I'm not talking just the opaque fence.
Right.
Opaque with the landscaping would work to solve a lot of the problems of seeing through the
Yes,
landscape.
I agree. But
It's young.
yeah, but it's not as nice looking as I hoped.
There is a solar facility I've seen in Marysville that has a wooden stockade
Yes.
fence around it. Now that's a flat site,
Mm-hmm.
but it is opaque and it's wooden, so. the fence looks nice.
Well, it wouldn't have to be 100% okay. It could be
Mhm.
70 or 60 with trees in front of it.
Mhm.
So you would see through the trees and end at the fence.
Mhm.
So you don't see it smack on as a fence,
Right,
but you see it through the filter of the
tree.
trees, which cannot do that kind of opaque.
Even with evergreen trees, you're still going to be seeing through the tree itself a little bit. So I mean, it's never
It'd be
going to
nice
be,
not to have the fence, but that's absolutely not negotiable. So,
like I'm saying, you're required to have a fence for safety purposes, electrical purposes. Use part of that requirement for a fence and make it part of your screening. So yeah, it is going to block the view. And I'm not saying put a big fence all the way around the facility. I'm talking about putting, just the sides, base residential uses where most people would see it.
well, she's gonna see it regardless because she's looking,
Well,
down on it, and there's a lot of ones that you
There's,
look right
to
down.
be
on.
honest, I can't see much you're gonna be able to do if you're looking down on it to stop seeing it.
Yeah.
It's just
But
I don't-
what's a
I don't
pleasant
see it.
view, you just look right down on that line.
But a
Understand that.
deeper
All of
setback and a wider buffer
Mhm.
planting, I think would certainly help with that.
So what are your thoughts as far as, so that's one of the discussion topics was setbacks yeah, and I can pull it up on the screen. We created a little graphic like we mentioned that we would.
This is in your choice, but, yeah.
Chris. Laura, do you want to do?
I've got it.
So while you're looking at Chris, you might go ahead here. How hard is, it's gonna be hard to write a code that fits everything, right?
Right.
So, because quite frankly, I mean, I like to see the screen, but it's out in the middle of nowhere, no one can see it in the first place. Now you get it with all this outside, and solid roof there. How hard is it to get a variance on that type of site issue? I mean, you say, "Ah, you really don't need this here." Yeah. Is that,
Well,
is that a public process, obviously?
And we can address variances in the code. There are some codes that we do not allow variances. Like the code says, you may not have a variance from this requirement. There are others where we then define what the amount of variance is allowable. And we also define who needs to agree to the variance. So in some cases, it's Jay as the zoning administrator. In other cases, there are variants that require going to the BZA for approval.
But never public.
BZA hearings, they're both public, right? So if you,
Good luck writing this code is what I'm saying. Yeah.
well, and see and that's what we're trying to stress is that the code needs to be general enough to cover all scenarios, but we have the mechanism in place with the planning commission that on a site-by-site basis, additional requirements could be put on top of.
Typically, what's the timeline for something like that? To
Or
go through that process?
the entire process, if I need to give a rule of thumb, I typically say a year. But it certainly takes longer. And Laura's gonna give me a thumb. Like, I've done a thumb up or a
I went through it
higher.
too, for something simple that I had.
Yes.
I tell people at least 18 months,
Yes.
a year and a half.
So you're saying, that through the process and it can go to the planning commission and then I don't know where the BZA comes into play in the current process.
It does not in the current
But
process.
a lot of what I was looking at for other counties, this community solar is conditional. It's a conditional use.
Yep, and we've noted that's something that was expressed by this group is that perhaps this should be a conditional use and not a principal use. So that would require going to the BZA early on in the process, and it would be a public meeting to look at what additional conditions from a BZA perspective should be added to the site.
Right, but as you said last week, conditional use isn't a no.
Right.
It's a probably if you do these other things.
And also conditional uses are usually done at the very beginning of the project.
Mhm.
Because there's no sense doing anything else until you get that approval.
Right.
So most things that go for conditional use, they do a very basic plan to start it to present to the PZA.
Mhm.
And it's just, like I say, that's where they're starting. And like I say, that is a public hearing process.
Yeah, they really don't get into site specifics. It's more of, it's determining if the use, how the use can be put there. So if contractor's equipment storage yard is conditional use. So they would say, indicate, this is generally what we want to do. We want to put a contractor's equipment storage yard on this property, and the BZA has to decide what additional requirements would need to be put on
But
it.
they take into account the surrounding properties and how it will
Yes.
impact residents.
There's 11 different things that they have to look at on impact, different impacts in the code. They have to take into consideration when making their decision. And in addition to just making a decision on whether it's conditional use or not, they can also put conditions on that use, very specific conditions in their decision that the applicant will have to follow after that.
Yep. So
And
that's-
there's a public notification process for that meeting
Yes.
as well. So, right, no,
Yes, yeah.
I don't know how broad here. There is a notification process.
Has any thought been given to grandfathering in these projects that are currently in the process? If this code is completely changed, what about the ones that are in the process now that were following the code that was in place at the time?
So that's not a staff decision, that's a commissioner decision. So that's something, so our intent, just to, kind of fast forward as to what Brenda and I have talked about as processes and how we're going to wrap this up, is once we finish the meeting, we're going to develop a report and a presentation, and we'll provide that to you all to take a look at, so to make sure that we've captured everything. We then talked about having a work session with the commissioners, and we would invite you all to be there also, so they can hear directly from you as far as those opinions. The commissioners would then make a decision, like what are the aspects that they think are appropriate or not appropriate and so on. But then they need to forward their recommendations to Planning Commission. So then Planning Commission would go through a process of discussing this, and it's up to Planning Commission. They could have additional work sessions to talk about it. Planning Commission then would forward a recommendation, and that's where we would start getting into the code language, recommendation of the code language to go back to the commissioners who would then have additional discussions, they could have additional work groups, bring you all back in and have more discussions. Once they come up with a final decision as far as what direction the commissioners want to go, then there needs to be a formal public hearing. So then all citizens would all comments would be submitted to the commissioners, and then the commissioners would make a final decision based on all of that. So that's why that whole process, that's why we've been pushing for these long meetings and have them right away, because we would really like to get this done in the 6 months before the moratorium elapses. And as you can imagine, all of those things take notifications and take time and so on.
Is
So
that the same flow chart that you provided in that first packet?
Well, I'm glad you said this, because it is what it is, because you had us blue.
Mhm.
So what you're really saying is that there is a shade of blue later on.
oh yes,
Otherwise, why are we not here?
yeah, oh yeah.
Well,
We-
and
we
then
do get it.
there was public comment, public input, or, yeah, I think it said public input on the.
But when you're putting together your white paper after that, then
Yes.
we get a chance to weigh in.
Oh, absolutely. And actually one of the commissioners reached out to us and mentioned this. He said, don't like excuse or retire the work group. And I said, absolutely not. We want you engaged until the commissioners tell us that this exercise is done, right? So we've indicated these meetings and but I would fully anticipate that we're going to still have these discussions and in various formats for the next 6 months. So.
We just don't know exactly what they'll look like yet, which is why they aren't on the flow chart.
So what happens if all of that doesn't occur within the 6-month moratorium?
Good question. So the way the moratorium is written, it will elapse after 6 months, right? In which case, unless something else is done, these projects will start back up again. Options to the commissioners, they could extend the moratorium longer. They could, maybe we have this all resolved by then. It's really up to the commissioners. And as questions as far as grandfathering and all that, that is typically written into the ordinance if a change is made. So and they would adopt an ordinance that would change the county code, and usually that ordinance speaks to grandfathering of projects. That's entirely up to the commissioners as to what they want to do one way or the other.
So have there been other types of zoning that have gone through a moratorium?
Yeah, we had a moratorium on residential building back quite a few years ago.
Nice.
And it was quite lengthy.
It was 2 years, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There has been, yes.
I can speak for all of what Sharon and I are doing. And I already have a statement drawn up as one of my sticking points because it's something everybody says. And I'm sorry, Patricia, but our feeling is all those facilities that are currently, all 8 of them, we're including Roberts, be denied at the planning and zoning level. That's it. So that's, I'm just telling it out there. It's not speculation at all. That was one of the founding premises of the group starting to work together as a group.
Yep, we understand what you're saying.
You can't speak for one and not speak for all.
One last procedural question.
Sure.
A lot why are we designating solar, community solar different than any other private enterprise? Why is it specific to community solar?
Are you comparing to other types of solar? or
Other types of solar,
businesses in general?
Other solar to solar.
Okay.
Well, I
solar-
could say other
why
types
we-
of businesses as well.
Yeah.
Why have we separated out community solar?
Right, so that goes back to the previous board and the direction that they wanted to take. And Brenda, correct me if I misspeak. So we saw solar on the horizon, right? And we knew that the state has the ability to override local zoning codes when it's utility size solar, right? So when they get that certificate, the CPCN, they can override local zoning codes. The state put out the state created this pilot project of community solar, which again, community solar is the business model. It's typically smaller, 2 megawatts, and to require subscription, right? So the state put that out, and to address that, that's why we wrote our local ordinance, was to allow it, but very prescribed, so that it wasn't open everywhere, and that's where we came up with the restrictions that we put in place in the ordinance.
I kind of get that, but then let's suppose I went to Pat and said, I'm a private guy, I want to do this project together.
Mhm.
You're not excluding me though. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I like the idea of we have parameters around
Mhm.
the state's parameters around a community solar project. But if it was a private deal, the
So you're
exact
talking-
same everything,
So you're talking utility
there's
scale.
no oversight with me. Would you allow that?
Well, we do
How
not.
do you code around that?
So say hypothetically, you're talking about a utility scale.
Yeah.
So you're talking about something greater than.
No, I'm talking same scale. I'm saying, if I
Well,
came in-
whether it's
identical
scale or
horizontal-
larger,
You would have to go to the Public Service Commission, right, and get a CPCN a certificate, the Certificate of Public Consumer Need, is that it?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity.
There we go, that's it. And they would, the state is required to take into consideration local zoning, but they do not have to conform to it. So, but prior to this, prior to our local code, we did not allow solar on ag at all, right? So they could come in and the developer would look at Carroll County zoning code and say, well, they don't allow it at all. And so they would then go back to the Public Service Commission and say, there's nothing to consider because Carroll County doesn't allow it on ag at all. So we want to go ahead and move forward. And the state could say, yep, you can go ahead and move forward. So our intent of creating the code was to provide those parameters. So if that case occurred, we could say, wait a second, we don't allow utility scale. We do allow community solar, and here are the parameters. So don't override us, follow our rules. Does that all make sense?
Oh, it makes sense.
But now we have a situation where if the Carroll County rules are too restrictive,
Mhm.
then someone like myself could go to the state and say, hey, they don't really want these here. They're too restrictive. And I could get that same certificate
Yep.
and have a 5 megawatt system on the same piece of property.
That's-
And that's where we need to go.
that's-
It's not an attempt.
It sounds like intimidation.
No, it's not. It's
It's-
reality.
it's-
That's-
Yeah.
It's fact. I know
Put
we
it out
don't like
there
it,
and,
but it's fact.
If
It's
it's
not-
intimidation.
I
It's
got us
not-
off track. I apologize.
And so is
As we go
throwing
through this
out
all the time, I
all
still
the
think
other
about
uses
But
on
that's a
ag
fact as
land.
well.
And
That's not why
one
we're here.
qualifies
We're
for
to
tax
discuss
credits, one doesn't.
community
Basically,
solar.
well, and still may, but I'd almost hate, I like to almost remove the word community and just say, gotta follow standards.
That's,
Well,
the community needs to be there because we're talking about the LMI community.
Excuse me.
We're
community
talking
solar.
specifically, there are other subscribers, but I will tell you, all the people we talk to, nobody once asked about, well, what about the subscriptions? Even when the people from the energy company and BGE came around and they called in the whole neighborhood, the blue suits are out, the yellow helmets are out. And it went around and nobody was interested. So we need to do it, if it's a state thing, I get it.
I'm okay with
But
that.
that's why it's here.
Mhm.
That's the reason. Let's just put,
No, I
all the
get it.
cover
No,
up.
I get that.
Okay. and that's fine. I
Yeah.
mean, We need to take care of everybody in our
It
community.
kind of gets back to, is it conditional?
Yes, and that absolutely is a comment that we heard from this work group, that the recommendation is conditional use, and
I just
we're
see,
fine with presenting that.
I see issues for debate. It's gonna mess up things if we don't group it all in one box.
So we put up the graphic here, so that's, hopefully everybody can see that, and I think we provided ones for you. The idea being is that there are a couple of dimensions that we've talked about, and we tried to illustrate the different scenarios. And really the two different dimensions, well, three. There's the width of the landscaping. There's the setback, which is the distance from the property line to where the solar panels start. And then there's separation from contiguous residential uses to the solar panels. So the example on the left is when there's a roadway between them. The example at the top is where there's no roadway. And then on the right, we don't have, that's where it's a non-residential type use. So we're looking for what your thoughts are on those three different dimensions: the width of the landscaping, the setback from the property line, and the separation from residents or non-residents.
Could you tell us what they are currently in the zoning?
Right now, the setback is 40 feet.
Setback is 40 feet. I don't,
Which is-
we,
What do you call this?
the setback,
Property
is- that's property line
From the
to the,
Right, it's the setback, yeah, the next one down.
this one here. Yeah, that's 40 feet.
And this is not to scale.
No,
This is-
yeah. We
40
don't,
feet from the property line to,
the solar, to the fence or
To the
solar
fence.
panels.
Not to
Solar
the
panels.
array, to the fence, right?
to the fence.
To the solar panels.
The solar panels.
I thought it was
And
fence.
to the structure. Okay, just like your house. If your house was on there, it would have to be at least 40 feet.
Right.
During the meeting where the commissioners were giving direction,
Yes.
Commissioner Kyler mentioned a 3,000-foot setback, and that's what we'd like to go with.
There was
You part of this?
there was
So
nowhere
to
in
the
Carroll
house.
County where you could get a
At least-
3,000.
That's impossible.
Can you,
280 is a
can you
mile.
go to another, because I think all of this, all of this is determined by the setback, the width of the buffering and the density of the buffering as well. So if you could, and maybe that's the case, maybe there's not an agricultural plot of property that could accommodate that. Maybe it needs to go in commercial, but there are places throughout the state. So if you, I don't know if you would mind going to another website for a moment, just to give a visual.
Sure.
It's Turning Point Energy.
Turning
Turning Point Energy. It's,
point energy.
yeah, it's turningpoint-energy.com.
This, turning point energy. Is this in here?
Yes. So they have, so something like this, of course, who's worrying about bufferings? But if you scroll down and you look at their projects, the first few in Maryland, they have, let's see, projects in the upper right corner, that projects tab. You go there and then it'll show some in Maryland. And
Do I need to click on
no,
there?
over on the left, you can start there. Let's see if that shows
This one?
you. Uh-huh.
Clicked on it, but
On the project profile, or you can go down the next one if that one doesn't work.
come on.
All of these fancy websites won't work.
Click on the project profile button. It flips over.
Yeah, how do I
All
make
right, go to
it?
the next one then, next one down. PG County, you click on that one. Not
Okay, hold
working.
on,
Yeah, no, it's just.
hold on. See, the problem is I've got a different view on the computer versus
Oh,
what's,
okay,
because I still have the GoToMeeting thing here. Okay.
okay, let's see what that one shows you.
Are we watching the video or am I scrolling?
No, there's photographs there of the project, and you can see that there's no residences at all around them. And that, if they have to be on ag land, that's where they should belong. And that's why we're pushing for the larger setbacks. You can click from that one and go back and go to the next one.
Okay.
Pretty much all of the ones, and I chose Turning Point Energy to look at because they're the company that's proposed next to me for that proposed project. But you can go to the next one, the next project, just go back and then choose, yeah, this one, Montgomery County. And if you just look at some of the overhead
Yeah, but I'm looking at this. I mean, what is?
What is that?
commercial, there's some commercial around
Okay.
some of them.
Are these community solar projects?
Yeah.
But it was three, the other one was, this is 2.5, the other
Yeah.
was 3.2 megawatts.
So the
They're allowed
state,
to buy.
yeah, the state has
The
increased.
state has allowed 5, but Carroll
Yeah,
County is
it's
talking
two.
about 2. Right.
But anyway, I just wanted you to have a visual
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
you know, that these projects, you know, we wouldn't be here if that's where Carroll County installed these solar projects.
Yeah.
Because they don't impact any residences.
That's right.
So just to clarify, so there are two of the different dimensions we're talking about. One is setback, which is from the property boundary to the structure. The other is separation from residential, a residential use to it, right? So we're seeing good separation here.
Yeah.
Who knows where the property line is? So the setback could be very close, but there's bigger separation, right? I just wanted to clarify the two different terms.
But if you have that larger setback, there's going to be separation.
I know in Carroll County, if you go at 3,000 foot separation distance, there's nowhere in the county that you can get that. There's absolutely nowhere in the county you can get 3,000 foot separation
Would
from any
you think we
residence.
could?
No, you couldn't get it in
No,
Carroll County.
then what? Then what would be the
It's-
largest setback?
We have right now, the current largest setback we have is 1,000 foot. And that usually applies to
The airport.
adult facilities,
Airports,
airports and stuff
Blackbirds.
like that. That's 1,000 feet. And of course, the airport's been in Carroll County longer than zoning, so it's the separation distance usually on that doesn't apply to residents because it's been there for a long time. But like I say, 1,000 foot, it was put into the code to, in a way, keep things out of the code, like adult entertainment facilities.
Mhm.
Because they can't be within 1,000 feet of any school, daycare, residence.
But that's separation though, that's not
That's what I'm
setback.
talking about, separation.
Okay,
Even
yeah.
going with a 3,000 foot separation, there's no place in Carroll County where you'd be able to get 3,000 foot separation in both directions, in all directions, from any residence. So you're actually talking about a radius of, or a diameter of 6,000 feet. And within that 6,000 feet, you're talking no residences.
Right.
There's no place in Carroll County that you can get that.
How many acres is that?
Well, I brought up, this is the Nora Valley, just to put things in perspective. This dimension along this property line is 1,300 feet.
Mhm.
So a 3,000 foot setback.
That's my property.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. But like I say, that,
That's
you're
more
talking
than
about
half a mile.
1,300 feet.
Yes.
It's more than half a mile.
So, I mean, we can take it down as an opinion,
Mhm.
but part of what we have to talk about is realistic, right? Because we understand that there's the desire not to have it on any ag, right? And we're absolutely going to present that to the commissioners. Creating regulations that make it impossible is kind of counterproductive, right? Because we already know there are some that don't want it. To then recommend regulations that make it impossible, why bother? Just don't allow it. And that's certainly on the table. I know there are commissioners that are considering that. So, so what I'd like to do is have the conversation of what would be realistic and feasible that you could maybe live with. And maybe there's nothing that you can live with, and that's fine. But a 3,000 foot separation just isn't realistic. So is there another dimension that maybe you could live with? And if there's not, then there's not. But you see where I'm going with it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do. I see where you're going with it. But this is a smaller piece of property.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there are larger pieces of property that
Yeah.
would be suitable.
What's-
But you're saying there's nothing in Carroll
There's
County.
no way, because you got to remember that 3,000 feet, that's going in all directions
Yeah.
from the facility. So like I say, you're talking 6,000 feet. And if you put a circle anywhere in Carroll County and draw
How many acres would that be? Does anyone know that?
6,000,
No,
Diameter.
It's over a mile.
how many
a
acres?
square mile is 640 acres.
There's not even a property in the county that's that large.
Yeah. So like I say, you could not get a 3,000 foot separation anywhere in the county from a residence.
Yeah. So I pulled up
And I
Patty's
deal with
project.
that all the time, so it's,
So to look at, I'll measure one dimension. So from Fanny Dorsey to the back of the property is 2,000 feet. So going 3,000 feet,
well, if you get to the center of that property, and if you just draw a 6,000 foot diameter
Yeah,
circle, you'll see that it's huge.
And that is the biggest property currently under review for solar.
so going 3,000 feet out, that the end of the cursor is out at 3,000 feet.
Jay, what typically informs setback sizes? The fact that the proposed use has noise or,
Well, I can give, we got a list of the uses that have to meet the 1,000 foot setback. Okay. These uses are the type of uses that have to meet the current 1,000 foot setback. Heavy chemical manufacturing, an airfield, a blast furnace, cement, lime, gypsum manufacturing, distillation of bones, fat rendering, grease, explosive manufacturing, storage, fertilizer, potash, insecticide, or gelatin manufacture, a junkyard, livestock sales yards and buildings, outdoor track street ranges, petroleum products refining, and slaughterhouses. They are the current uses in addition to the adult entertainment that have to meet the 1,000 foot setback.
the stuff that's
Setback or
producing objectionable
Sounds.
sound,
Sound, noise, smoke, odor,
Safety.
safety. yes.
Was that setback or separation? The 1,000 feet. Setback, right?
It was separation. What is
Separation.
separation?
Separation.
Difference between separation and setback. The setback is the distance from wherever the object is to the property, strictly to the property line. A separation distance is from the use to any other type of use for any.
Yeah, but you said setback, and I think you meant separation.
Yes, separation.
We were talking separation.
Okay. By the way, a 6,000 foot diameter circle is 650 acres.
Okay. And 650, and we don't have any properties that
No.
are 650 acres at all in the county?
The reservoir.
What was the biggest?
Oshawa, maybe.
Hold on.
But as you say, Oshawa's a whole bunch of different properties. It's not just one.
Yeah, it's all in one.
Yeah.
That's still, that doesn't count. That doesn't count.
I just want to note, I think it's noteworthy. So we do have solar in commercial as well as industrial, which we've already talked about, but the setbacks in there as written, right, are in commercial and employment districts, we're at 400 feet from the boundaries of all adjoining residentially zoned properties, 200 feet from adjoining non-residentially zoned properties.
And also, the planning commission can reduce
Yeah.
that by 50%.
If they put landscaping, which is not required in that zoning district, then planning commission can reduce that by up to 50%. Okay, so that's commercial and employment campus. And then in industrial, it shall be 200 feet from adjoining residentially zoned and 100 feet from non-residentially zoned property. Again, with that provision that the planning commission may reduce that setback up to 50% if there is landscaping provided. So that's what it is for those zones. We're going to.
Can I ask a question in terms of that? If I want on my property, what's the setback?
There's two things. The normal setback for a farm building is 30 feet. However, it must be 200 feet from any residence on a lot, less than 3 acres. So there's kind of a if and and or thing. So
Okay.
it would have to be at least, 200 feet from that property line if there was a residence on it. But if there's no residence on it, then it could be close to 30 feet.
So there are two properties in Carroll County that are greater than 650 acres. Liberty Reservoir, owned by the city, and I believe this is Springfield Hospital, owned by the city.
Oh, yeah.
Other than those two, the next largest is 561 acres, and that's also owned by the state. I'm not sure which one that is.
Probably would be wrong.
Could be Morgan Run. I mean, I can zoom to it.
I think Piney Run's like 300 some
Tiny
acres.
ones, tiny ones.
300 acres.
That one just flashed. What is that? Stop it. I'm not sure where we are. That was Springfield. Yeah. But anyways, so just to put it in context. So, I mean, to get back to the discussion then, I mean, as far as like setback and separation, are there smaller dimensions that would, you feel that would make sense, looking at relative distances?
Well, I think we were thinking of, our definition of setback was more separation
Right.
in terms of that.
Okay.
But I really don't want to negotiate much. I mean, if it's out of if it's out of the realm that we have to do it at 1,000, then we have to do the 1,000. But if that's what you're not going to accept any greater than that. But I think we need to go on the record as to say, we don't want it anyway. So
No, but-
1,000
yeah,
to 2,000.
Right.
I mean, I'm a good well over 1,000
Mhm.
from well over 1,000 from that site from me, and I can see it.
Mhm.
Clear as a bell.
Okay.
I don't care what you put on it, I can see it.
But as was just the list of things, if you think about the
A junkyard
use,
fits very well.
Well, actually, junkyards, the only junkyards that out in the county are the ones that existed prior to 1965.
Yeah, and there's one right now there.
Yes, well, like I say, they were all existing prior to 1965, and none of them have any expansion possibilities.
Correct.
What they were in 65 is what they are today.
and the list of those uses, I'm going back to that, require that 1,000 foot, they are generating either sound or some noise, noxious fumes, something of that sort. So it's hard to take that and translate it to aesthetic, right, of a use.
Is it? It's a visual, it's a
That was created.
quality of life impact on surrounding residents. Why is it difficult to translate it?
Because viewscape is much different than inhaling or hearing or, right? You
Right.
choose,
It's
Nobody's
choose to look at.
Nobody's
It's
guaranteed a
right.
view.
Just like inhale, just like breathing.
Nobody is ever guaranteed a view when you buy your property. That's just it. Nobody is ever guaranteed a
Viewscape
view.
is not a protected
Not-
right.
It's not
That's not
something
what
that
we're
you
here
are.
to discuss.
No, I know it's not, but what I'm saying is,
Translates to the setback. The
is
separation.
these setbacks are based on something very specific.
Yeah.
Noise, dust, odor, smell, whatever.
Yeah.
Where if
Site
there's none of
is
that,
One of those
if-
same senses. Why are you excluding that? That
because
isn't
you can't,
happening at
there's no
quality
way
of life.
you can guarantee that.
You can't guarantee what
No,
you're gonna
I
hear
cannot
either,
guarantee
or
you
what you're gonna
anywhere.
smell.
There's,
It's a
there are
sense.
places in Carroll County where you can, if you really look hard enough, you can see the 60-acre field at Mount St. Mary's College. You sit on top of the mountains out there, you can see it all. So your viewscape is not guaranteed, nowhere. And that's
Either
settled in
are
case law.
any of the other senses that you're,
No,
that
it's
are
not what it
changing
is.
your quality of life.
It's what it's going to affect. Viewscape is not guaranteed. It's been settled in case law.
But it is something that should be taken into consideration.
I understand that, but what I'm saying
And there's a
though,
term called view shed.
right, in the state of Maryland, nowhere in the state is viewshed a guarantee. There are,
It may not
there
be
are
a
court cases
guarantee.
court cases that say you can't base something on that.
Okay.
So you
There
can't.
are, but there are other counties that are taking it into consideration, and it can be by Carroll County. This is a county where people moved here for the aesthetics, for the view of the agriculture. Okay, so that's what we are here to represent, the people of this county that do not want that view shed of that solar farm.
Like I said,
And that is, the best case scenario for that is the ag press. Anything in ag press
Well,
is not.
you can't.
And I just mentioned that every easement that I ever wrote, one of the attributes in the easement mentions view shed. Every easement
And we do have height
that I ever
restrictions on
wrote
buildings.
in here.
Yeah, and it's not just the agricultural, some of them are historic.
Chris, I'm gonna ask you another, just a question.
Sure.
Because I'm not sure about this. How many parcels are remainder parcels? You mentioned the amount of acres, but how many
Yeah.
parcels actually exist that are over 20 acres?
Oh my goodness, you're asking me to do analysis on the fly here.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
The way the code's written now, we have the numbers for 5 and over.
Right.
Which.
No, I'm asking.
Yeah.
Well, but.
But I mean, that would, that's, okay, so that's
What
what
I'm
we have to
saying,
figure out.
this is just something I'm
Yeah.
thinking about.
So-
If we would take, I mean, Ag Press should know this, and maybe they don't know it. But if, I want to know how many acres are over 20 acres that would be eligible for solar.
Okay.
Have
So
remainders.
that are just strictly remainders.
Just how many.
See, So that's some reason why I'm in here, because
Right.
if we got to get the potential of how many parcels out there. The gentleman says 0.110, whatever it was, but I'd like to know how many parcels and where they are. Are they contiguous parcels? That's remainders, so that you might have 12 of these on contiguous parcels, or you might only have one in a
Yes.
square
So,
mile.
I'm sorry, if I can interrupt, I've got lots of good data that I can show you. But what I'd like to do is let's finish this discussion about setbacks
Well-
and while we have Jonathan here.
Excuse my age, because I don't answer questions.
No worries. And we've got some
I
good
thought it was
information for you.
important.
Yep. So I've heard the opinions as far as setback and separation. So let's move on from that. The width, are we at a break time?
No, it's just a reminder. you see.
You know, I would leave. Right, right.
Do you all want a 5-minute break now? It's 5 o'clock. Yes.
5 minutes.
And then we'll come back and start,
Yeah,
get
and
back
we'll-
to this
Yeah, we'll
discussion.
just talk about the width of the buffers, and then we'll move on.
Did you say 6,000 square feet is equal to 650?
A circle that's 6,000 feet in diameter
Is 650?
is 650 acres. Yeah.
To make sure we're.
All right, let's take 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene.
Yes, I can do. If nothing, this is the number of residual. That's just the question we asked.
Is that the remaining portion is not being, only gotta be. I know. Right. And not without a lot of research.
You had a map at some point that you shared with all of us. That shows all the remainder portions.
Yeah, that's online.
Yeah.
So maybe we did have it. I wasn't aware that we had done this.
Yeah, but it's 5 acres of greater.
So there's a difference. And that's based, in that case, it's based,
It was taxed.
they say if it's 3 acres.
So I
Any
put it in
barn
barn
is 200 feet from property.
Can you get it that
If
long?
that property
How many
is
people?
3.01 acres,
I'm sorry, I didn't
currently
understand.
you would have to
How am I
be
gonna get?
300 feet from the residence.
Large.
So this contiguous non-residential is not necessarily like it can apply on the same property, right? I have a house on the property and solar on the property. Would there be a distance requirement?
No.
It doesn't.
People don't want cheaper taxes on the
If
residual.
I have a barn on that property, it
Because the only way you get
has
that
to be a
is
certain
to.
distance.
So I've got some information also, but
I mean, how much does the tax base?
I'm almost
But
grateful I don't
our
work in the
goal is
summer.
to
No offense, but.
guide the business.
No, I get that.
Okay.
I'm not trying to roll. Yeah, actually, I think that's question first or second meeting. I don't know how many residual properties we have.
Okay.
And what's available.
Okay, so you're
And the
saying
county's
you
gonna do
That would be my.
Right, and code.
Yeah.
The commercial industrial, the last meeting we gave that information. Yeah, so the percentage of
Did you get the
property.
acres or did you get percentage?
I guess
If you gave both, if you gave total acres.
What's on the agenda? Anything good?
Hey,
JC?
Yeah,
Nursing homes Friday, today is
Yeah. I think it's a big pull around.
upward.
Okay. Let's get to that discussion.
I'm not gonna interfere with that. I still sympathize
I'm thinking the
with
one,
how you write a code.
that's the one that everybody's talking
And
about.
really, when I was asking about, I actually kind of knew the answer, but the appeal process.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that.
No.
Because you gotta write it kind of close, but you have.
Did you get that? You're upstairs in San
Someone said this, and everybody sat there and looked and go, oh, that, yeah, we would,
But that
we could
one's,
work with that.
no, luckily that
No,
one just got
no
done last time.
setback
But
is
this one for
a
the
topic,
Westminster actually kind
I
of.
guess, to the state.
It's kind of cool.
But-
It's a cemetery that
But you have
is,
that.
it was
But yeah, I
like
think you gotta write a code
established
that's,
for African American veterans.
what is one out of 10 too many exceptions.
Forever ago, there was
Oh,
a law in Westminster
Yeah.
that
One out of
That's
10.
what
Very
That's what it is, or be
So,
eliminated.
now this group, these volunteer groups that work with the cemetery and the company in
Community
church
is
are working
counterproductive
like pro bono.
to come up with
bring it
requirements
to the
that are
city
so
with
strict.
active
that you
But
can't-
just say we don't like it.
Then just say we don't want it.
Yeah, just zone it out.
Because my
And you don't have to write
husband
code,
is
but you
right
got
across
to allow
the
it.
lighting.
Yeah, right over there,
I
right
already
over
know.
there.
That's
Sure.
reasonable. Now, kind of just fixing on the-
Yeah, yeah.
Honestly,
And, yeah, like the shakers are all working on pro bono, CLSI.
and I'm gonna go with
That's so
this.
cool. And it's really
That's
cool.
not a threat.
Nice.
Yeah.
I don't mean.
That
that
would should be
threat.
right.
No, but I
It's
get it.
what-
And check-
What's gonna happen,
that's
when you're
kind
gonna
of-
have a bigger field than you wanted,
Yeah.
you're just causing more problems.
Actually, and I kind of thought, I was asking why specific community,
Mhm.
because I know other bigger projects are going on.
Right, but even within community, the state allows 5 megawatts. We're talking about 2 megawatts, so I'm gonna have twice the size.
I get that, but I don't care about that personally.
But it becomes a
I
bigger
still say,
field.
or some big technology. let's
Right,
do
and
that.
it'll be on 10
So
feet.
I think we're really talking, to me, I think if you really survey everybody, really talking space, not megawatts.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I don't care if you get 0.5 or 500, if it's on the same.
Right,
area.
I agree, I agree. And you're right, technology will change over time. and Who knows, maybe we'll have nuclear in our cars. Who
Yeah.
knows? Like in Back to the Future, remember that? They got the garbage
Yeah,
can.
yeah. Ownership.
Mhm.
You don't have to do that.
That's true.
10 years from now.
That's true, but the company originally was now, is probably gonna sell it. And that's a risk.
Yeah, that's the biggest. That's why I never sell. I'm a little bit of a club though, if you
Mm-hmm.
know, like the TV show. Like, that's why.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not saying it might be worth it, no risk, no reward.
Right, that's right. But there is risk for
But
that.
there's risk. It comes across when you read this, like, oh, no, we're just rolling all the risk.
No,
No, I don't know who that person is. I don't know who that entity person, whatever you want to say is.
But our lease with the developer covers a lot of those details.
But I said this, I handle litigation. You can be right. You can win an award,
$1 million judgment against Pearson. He doesn't have $1 million. So what? I won, but what do I get? You gotta watch a piece of paper. might not be worth it.
Time, I guess.
The property's really-
I thought we weren't included.
Oh, no, we want to keep you engaged. Yes.
I think it would be beneficial to have the commissioners in this conversation.
Well,
So we can whittle it down.
right, yeah, so after each one of these meetings, I give the commissioners just a, hey, we've had our second meeting, whatever, and I provide them the link to watch the video, so.
Now, I haven't been able to watch the videos, but the commissioners can.
You're able to also, we had a
Or they
technical.
have, yeah, they're not
You didn't get
online
the
yet.
first one,
Yes, they are.
They are now.
Yes.
The other
Did you get
day
the
they
first one,
weren't.
or is it-
Yeah, we had a technical difficulty at the end of last week, but as of this weekend, they're
No,
both available.
Yeah.
They were doing,
Yes.
like a
Yeah.
website.
How much
This isn't
input
what
did
it
the
is.
Ag Press office have in writing this
We're
up?
going some kind of maintenance when the day we met. And I asked
I
if
wasn't
you
involved in
need
it when this was written originally.
some problem
I was
with links
just
and
curious.
Yeah.
so, you know,
Actually,
you couldn't get our stuff up there.
They didn't do a bad job writing this when I
And I think
read
we have
this thing probably 10
Well, you can get
times.
it, you can get it on YouTube, because a lot of people.
They didn't do a bad job.
And then, yeah, that's how, because that's what it is.
County's YouTube channel instead.
Mhm.
So that links to that. So that's how, that's how I think.
That makes sense.
Are you taking minutes of everything
I'm not
that's
taking
in
this, it's just my notes.
your personal?
But I need to be able to go back and look at what we talked about adoption.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Anyway.
All right, so if we could, let's wrap up the discussion of landscape bumpers and so on. Just real quick, what are folks' opinions on the width of the landscape buffers, both adjacent to residential uses and non-residential uses?
I would say 100 feet for adjacent to residential use.
Okay.
And as well as the roadway. I think,
Yes,
because
yeah.
of the visual impact that it
Okay,
presents.
so you think 100-foot buffer? Okay,
Landscape
Landscape
buffer,
buffer.
which includes the fence.
yes, yep,
So again, as Jonathan reminded us, like, the narrower that is, and the denser that could potentially be,
well,
Can't do
right?
both.
Yeah, I just realized that if you say, I want to, like, I was pointing out that our most dense screens mandate a 15-foot wide buffer. You could call that, you could say, okay, well, that 15-foot wide is going to be 100 feet wide. But that doesn't increase your density unless you
increase.
build in a denser screen.
Right,
Because you could spread that, in fact, it would probably be less dense because you could spread that 15-foot width over 100-foot
Right.
width, and you have kind of more like that picture you were showing where you thought it was pretty bad screening
Yeah.
because it was so wide, and you just had tree here, tree here.
Yeah.
But why do you have to?
So-
make it
You don't
less
have to.
dense?
right. So I think, not to put words in your mouth, but I think what you'd be looking for is 100-foot width, but with a certain density of trees planted within that 100 feet. That's increased.
With the
Then-
staggering evergreens,
Yes.
right, we
Yeah.
talked about. And
So-
then,
So if it's in the ag zone, you're eating up more and more and more agricultural land, which is what we're trying not to do. So,
well, it's already being eaten up.
Temporarily though.
but that 100 feet, if it has to be within inside that 20 acres, I'm not sure how you're gonna make all this work. You're gonna have more than 20 acres.
Yeah.
So we're trying to save as much
Well,
agricultural
let's do
land
the
as
sites
possible.
like hers.
Or you're gonna create little corridors of land, and if this ordinance holds up, then you'll have a lot of unfarmable land, where we're trying to keep land farmable.
So if the goal of
We're
the
fighting
land,
against ourselves.
sorry,
on all this.
if the goal of the landscape buffer is to, we've talked about incorporating a fence, we've talked about incorporating an opacity element to that. And then if we add plantings to that, if the goal of that is truly screening, visual screening, correct? Then I would think whatever that width that we can then look for a density to the screening that those plantings will survive and creates that opacity would be the goal of the landscape width. Now, the setback or the separation to the actual panels, right? That may be that's a completely different category here, right? So if the goal of the landscape buffer is to create that opacity, then what is a satisfactory width to that? And then I think we can move to talk about the setback, the separation, the distance requirements. And again, Jonathan pointed out a certain case scenario where, putting these landscape plantings right up close to the panels, that was not necessarily advantageous, right? So now we're moving into a conversation about what is that setback or what is that separation to the actual panels, right? So if we ask the question again, landscape width, what is reasonable to get a good dense screening if the goal is opacity, right? To get the heights that we're looking at plus the fence, I would defer to you, the expert. Like, what is it good? You said class A is, or class, what did you say, 15 feet is?
Yeah, so our most dense screening, our class C, has 15-foot minimum width of buffer. And the idea of the buffer width is twofold, really. It's to be able to accommodate the amount of material you need to stick in it, but it's also giving a little bit of separation between, I think in these situations, they're thinking that you have a residential house fairly close to a property line and that you have a bit of a separation then by virtue of the landscape width to the car wash or the gas station. So I almost think our landscape buffer width here, it's more important for us to set a reasonable size that can accommodate the density of material we want. And we're achieving the separation through the setback and the separation values. Less, the landscape buffer width is more appropriate to set related to our density.
Well, I want you to understand where I'm coming from, because we're representing Farm Bureau. So we're talking about the ag zone. So I don't care if it's 300 feet commercial. I don't care what it is in commercial. I don't care if it's a berm in commercial. But we're talking here about trying to do two things at once. One is put, if we would allow, solar on ag remainders, and then trying to preserve and keep as much land available for farming or agricultural use as possible. So we start eating up all this land in all kinds of berms and setbacks and all that kind of stuff. Then you're gonna have land that's not farmable. And so then you might as well change the zoning altogether, which is not what we ever want to do.
And
So that's where I'm coming from. That's why I'm so concerned about what's left over. After all, if all this happens, what's left over? What is agricultural land which you want to see?
Okay, let's, if you don't, if Patricia doesn't mind me using hers as an example because it's in my head.
Do you want to, can you bring up mine?
Well,
And is Charlie on the line? Did we lose Charlie?
Oh, yeah, I think he is. Yeah.
her solar site is 13.25 acres, correct? Right, and she has not even leased the 20 acre maximum. She's only leased 15 acres.
Right.
So pretty much she has done the best work according to what you're talking about with what she has. They can put the 13, 0.25, which is the 2 megawatts, and they can do it with everything that we're talking about in 15 acres. So that left 5 acres, which is substantial between the 20 maximum that could have happened. How many acres, if we put 100 feet buffers around her property, how many acres would that be? Would that use up her 2 acres?
But it also changes the way the arrays are laid out. So in my,
So
Do you
where are
have
they going,
my-
where are they going to be?
I can
So
show
what
you
you've
my,
got the forest, the
my
trees on one
concept
end.
plan. And I'm sorry, can you bring this up on yours? This is what was submitted. So this is my 125 acres. This is the
Chris,
Array.
Well, you can get to it through the development process. but
Yeah.
yes, Chris.
This is the array, so if you change these setbacks, let's say you change this one to make this 400 feet or something, then the array is gonna have to go closer to these homes. So the array has to work on the parcel that's being leased. And if it means they need to lease more land to get that amount, that's what they'll do. And the reasons why this is shoved in this corner of my parcel, this is all flat land with no trees. And this is, I think it's a 345 kilowatt, 345,000 kilowatt power line with the big poles that are right here that these neighbors all look at. And they have not complained about this. That was there when they bought their property. But now this is the eyesore.
But in terms of what you were talking about, she's done, you know,
The best job
she's
I
done the
could.
best job that she could in saving those 2 acres.
And you'll
So-
see also, we did landscape buffing here, and we required from our developer to landscape behind our neighbors here to block their view.
So what is the width of your buffer?
Pardon me?
What is the width of your buffer?
I
Did
don't know.
do you know?
Well,
I'm
it's,
trying to see that.
I know from this property line to these solar panels, it's 400 feet.
400 feet. So
But that's,
the property
that's in
line.
this scenario.
Mhm.
But you can't do that on every property. You can't.
So currently,
Wait, I'm sorry, that's not the width of the
farmers
buffer,
aren't
right?
planting.
No, that's
That's
the
the
setback.
We're not the setback, separation.
No, that's the setback from their property line to the solar panels.
Okay.
From their,
What
from
is
their
it?
home, it's.
Farmers do have a buffer now, that, I mean, they're not farming right up to their property line in most cases.
And I do.
Right up on the road,
Unless the-
county
unless
right of
it's
way.
along the street.
Sorry?
never-
Big farm in the
Yeah,
county
you
right of way, right up to the edge of the road.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I
Yeah,
think
not
there's.
not in my area. I've seen, there is pretty wide setback.
And the value for her is she's got more deep further.
But think about this, if you
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
the setback,
So they'll go
and I
right up
need
to
to take
the,
up this whole
I'm
front.
sorry, I can't hear every conversation, right?
Oh, there's one down there that's.
Yeah, if you change these setbacks, and now to make it work, I have to take up this whole front field, then these acres are no longer gonna be farmed, because it wouldn't be worthwhile. And that's what we wanted to preserve the farmland and have this in as small a spot as possible. And this was the scenario that worked on our property.
But I think the point that you're trying to make is what she's saying is it's gonna give more. So if you're gonna consider it at all, you know, it is to do what somebody's gonna choose to do and leave more in conservation. And, you know, that has nothing to do with the fact that we're against the whole thing.
No, I
again.
understand.
But to see if we can say 100 feet or whatever, how much of that 2 acres? I don't think you can do a solar field in, there are some that are 10 that are in the
Yeah,
community.
there's some-
solar.
But if
There's
you
some that are
change the
10.
setbacks,
Yeah.
you're gonna lose some farmland, because they're
Well,
probably
yeah.
farming around.
Yeah. But, and
And
there's also a question of, you know,
Yeah, so I think the 15 feet is like,
is nothing. It's definitely nothing.
and I don't think 100 feet is unreasonable.
You know, I don't
So-
see that because,
think about it this way too, again, if we're just talking about the landscaping width, right? If you do 100 feet, and then now next we're gonna talk about how is it even possible to achieve the density of the screening within that 100 feet plus a fence, right? But if that whole thing, I think this was where Ralph was going too, if that whole thing becomes planted in one sense or another, there is a lifespan to these, whether or not we choose to acknowledge it, believe it or not, but at some point, the solar panels will be decommissioned, and this will go back to being farmable land. But if you have 100-foot width all the way around or part the way around of these plantings, that is in perpetuity unless you go cut those trees down, right? Like,
And give up.
Yeah.
so you have to, like, that's not part of the decommissioning. That is not going away. So the panels may go away, but now you got to work within whatever you have left. Correct?
Correct.
I mean,
And
I
I'm
think
concerned that you
here-
can't cut those trees down.
Yeah.
And I'm also concerned in that same respect that if all this is under an easement, which would be my goal,
Mhm.
this is not then this then is subject to all the stuff that you would allow in that ag zone.
Correct.
And that bothers me also.
Which is
But
why
it's
we
already
need-
allowed
That's
there.
why we need the buffer.
No, that
Yeah,
doesn't change his
That's a whole
concern.
different thing. If there's decommission,
Anything
that's
else can go in there.
decommission, then anything in that long list of whatever's on agricultural zone land can be put there after those things are gone.
On aggravated.
So this lady here decided to put all of this under easement, which is a noble thing in my book. But
Without
that
any
is not
compensation.
under easement because it's a commercial operation, still on ag zone land. So if that's decommissioned, now we got a 20 acre property there that could have slaughterhouse,
Contractors.
contractors, equipment storage,
Church.
church.
house.
Let's keep going on for the list that's that long, and that's what bothers me.
But I
You gotta remember that.
But
I know
But you don't know.
But if you're gonna,
Yeah,
if all this is gonna happen,
any
well,
remainder.
what I'm saying,
Because it bothers
but-
you.
because we're here to see what the future of solar is and what's gonna happen. So we're gonna talk about decommissioning, right?
Yes.
So if it's decommissioned, then that's just another remainder that can happen, that a lot of stuff can happen on, including a commissioner that would say, well, since all these houses are here, let's just put houses there too.
Ralph,
And
what you're saying
I'm
is-
looking way down the line here. We're talking the welfare of Carroll County down the road. And we've spent millions of dollars here to preserve open land in Carroll County. People flock here to enjoy a lot of that viewscape, view shed. And then that happens, and then what happens after they're decommissioned?
So are you suggesting that after it's decommissioned, the easement expands?
That's what I was just wondering, if you could have the solar
See,
panels supported.
I didn't know where to put this in the conversation, but from day one, when I'm looking at, and there's so many things here. How can you get 2 megawatt, what are they, kilowatt, what are they? Megawatts. How can you get 2 megawatts on 7 acres, which one of these is, and then the next one, it takes 20 acres to put 2 megawatts on? I don't understand that
They're
either.
just leaving space between the things.
Well, it's also how the
And
terms
it's
have to be
how
laid
it
on the
fits,
property.
how it fits.
They're not just a square that you plunk down.
Yeah.
You have to arrange it properly. So they were able to do it on the 7 acres where it took 13 for mine, just because of the way the land,
And yours is 2.
2 megawatts.
Okay.
They all go to the max, which is 2. I didn't see one that was under 2
Oh,
megawatts.
there's a breaking point that makes economic sense at this stage.
And the difference between 2 and 5 is the real, is the
Okay,
real worry.
I've said enough, Chris.
Well,
But
sorry.
I think it's interesting about what you said though, because this is a conservation easement, all right? Not a preservation. So if I decided I was going to develop a church on this property, I could do that today. And I could sell the rest to the county at $4,000 an acre. Is that correct?
No,
No,
it's a remainder. You get nothing.
For remainders?
No,
Nothing.
there,
No,
so,
There's no appraisal difference.
you can sell it, but not in the easement program.
so, yes, you can.
Yeah, you can.
But it won't, it won't score.
We-
the
Remainder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Change the law.
We have
changed
changed it, we have changed policy. We are now
Well, I
taking.
have been away from here for a long time.
It was already in law. It wasn't.
Yeah.
And what is it?
I'm glad they let her.
Remaining-
I want to hear this.
Remaining portions,
You might want to hear
if remaining portions, if you have a remaining portion, you can apply to go into ag pres. The valuation of it is based on the development rights.
So it wouldn't
If you
be much
don't, if you
difference.
don't have many development rights, your value goes down considerably, but you can still go into the program.
But it
And
was
the reason-
scored up.
Right, the reason why we do that is because there are other development potentials on that property, such as putting a church, putting a contractor's equipment storage yard, and so on. So there was value to putting remaining portions into the easement program. Also, code could change. So in the future, someone, even though right now that property doesn't have any residential development rights, the code could change to give it residential development rights. So putting those remaining portions into the program made sense. But how much we pay for them is significantly lower because we factor that into the
Yeah, the
appraisal value.
appraisal differences.
Yeah.
But that kind of flies in the face of why it became a remainder property to start with. Because I did something to create a remainder property,
Mhm.
which basically, if because it's my decision to do that. I knew I was devaluing the remainder. And now we're putting value back on it that we never had.
No, your remainder still has value for other
It
things.
has value, but
It's just not as much value.
not much, that's right.
So that's the difference. I mean, I could put a contractor's equipment storage yard on that remainder.
Absolutely.
That's still a value to that property.
Yes, there's development value there.
So there is development value left in that remainder.
Mhm.
It's just that you can't put houses on
Yeah, well,
That's
I
the only
I
difference.
hope the scoring
So what does
process
the county
doesn't
pay
change.
for that, for those types?
It's
Depends on
property
the building?
by property, there's other factors that go into it, but the value typically cuts it about half.
So if there's no residential
No residential,
building,
yeah.
what would they?
So going rates right now, if you have development rights, 8,000, 9,000 an acre.
No, wait a minute. You say development rights, you're talking about residential.
Residential,
I'm
yes.
talking about
That's what we're
non-buildable
talking-
remainders. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, but
I'm
Lee,
talking
like,
about
I have
non-buildable
I
remainders,
have a remainder, but I
non-residential
still have
buildable
one,
remainders.
I have one building right. This is a remainder property, but I could put one house
One
on.
house on.
Okay, so there's all sorts of remainders. That's
Yes.
what I'm
Yeah.
talking about is a non-buildable remainder.
But you can build a church.
I'm talking
And
about
that's development. And if you
residential.
build a church, it's not an ag anymore.
To me, a non-buildable remainder is where you can't put residences on that property.
Right,
Okay.
but you can.
So when the Ag Preservation Program
That's a
was
remainder. That's not a
valuing,
remainder.
was valuing those farms on the residential potential. So you would put it under easement, that's what we were valuing. We weren't valuing it on a storage yard or something like that. We were valuing it strictly on knocking out residential housing on ag land. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes, and what I'm saying is that we have changed the policy
Okay,
that we are now accepting applications for properties that are remaining portions that do
well,
not
how comes
have.
nobody knows that?
I knew that.
We've had a lot of applicants, yes. But we've had a lot of applicants. But, okay, yes, we need to circle back because, yeah.
Eating up space.
Yes.
That's where we were.
So, if I may, if I can ask John a question. From your perspective, assuming that we had a screening that is all evergreen, how wide a screening at typical planting spacing for like a forest conservation or a tree stand?
Well, if it was a 9-foot tree, how wide would that tree be?
Well, but you have to factor in growth of that tree and survivability and all that. So typical planting spacing, right? So, and what kind of width of all evergreens would you think could achieve a, say, 80% opacity?
Stagger them and get them
Yes,
as
yes.
close as possible, but not too each other.
Well,
Yeah.
is the maturity about 15 feet in width?
Depends on the species.
Depends on, I mean, you can get the ones that are
Right.
straight up and down. And then the height goes up to like 50, 40, 50 feet
Right.
at maturity for,
You're,
That's probably about it.
very complicated question, but I
Yeah.
would boil it down to, that typically when I think of a very dense evergreen screen, you typically have essentially 2 rows staggered.
Okay,
So in that scenario, I would say a 20-foot wide width would be appropriate.
okay,
I wouldn't see any sense to a width larger than 30.
okay.
Because as soon as you're getting larger than 30, all you're doing is spreading that material that you're trying to gain density and opacity with
Mhm.
over a larger area. And that's not helpful to the opacity or the density you're trying to create.
Now, could you, if we did, let's say a 30-foot width, could we increase density requirement for that 30-foot width?
Sure, so like, for instance,
More
like,
trees,
I had
2 rows,
mentioned-
3?
Like
Yeah.
berms or something.
I had mentioned that there's a double Class A standard for when you're screening against very heavily traveled roads and you're in a residential situation, like your backyard's backed up to 140 or 97. So that's a good example of where you want a wider width, and I'd say 30 feet would be, 30 feet's double the 15. because if a Class A has to be actually within 10 feet, the minimum Class A width is 10 feet. So if you're going to double that, you got to have a width of at least 20. So I'd say between 20 and 30 would be appropriate to achieve what Jay's talking about, which is increasing of density above what we typically have in our standard classes.
And if you threw in a couple of bushes here and there, could you get to 50 feet
So,
and still be dense?
yeah, I think you got to think about what's the advantage of that additional width though, really? I mean, typically width and setbacks are trying to provide separation because something smells bad, is loud, things like that. Whereas here, if you have a really adequate screening that's really done well, what does it matter if that use is 50 feet from you or 1,000 feet from you? If you've got a good, if the use is essentially silent, it's not producing noise, it's not producing a smell, it's not producing anything objectionable other than aesthetics, and you have a good screening, what does it matter how much it's separated? I don't see where it matters that it's separated substantially by thousands or hundreds of feet versus tens of feet.
It puts more distance between a viewer who's viewing it. It just adds that other dimension that is invisible to you, but it's visible to the.
That sounds more like a separation,
Yeah.
like a distance thing.
But
But it's still landscaping, which still takes away the farmland in the future. So
I think what John said, if you only see, I'm going to exaggerate, if you only see 1 foot into the forest, what's it matter if there's another 100 feet behind it? And that's what I mean, don't put up bamboo, but that would.
That would take up all of it.
So would what John said be adequate if all of that is still placed further away? Like if the separation is 100 feet, would the 20 feet or whatever be adequate for the landscape if it's still further
So
away?
I would advocate very strongly for not dictating that the landscaping have to be a certain distance from the property line, because it's actually advantageous to neighboring viewers in some cases to have that landscaping be able to be placed immediately adjacent to the property line, just because of the aspect and how you might be elevated or you might be situated.
In the double A, that's currently in your manual, is that the one where you said staggered evergreens is usually, it's going to be back up to 140 or whatever it is?
Yeah.
So is that the only planting material used then, or are there shrubs and deciduous trees as well?
So the Class A doesn't.
Double
Yeah, and the double A, they don't have, I can read you what it says.
A. Where is it?
And we don't have to just say it's going to be that.
Right.
Whatever the requirements are for this, we'll just write into this.
But right now, the Class A says this: the function of a Class A is to provide a visual screen that will give the required level of height, density, and opacity depending on site conditions. The screen may range from a solid linear screen of evergreen trees where maximum opacity is needed to a loosely staggered screen where a filtered view is appropriate based on site conditions. A combination of major deciduous trees, minor deciduous trees, evergreen trees, and shrubs may be used. So it leaves it wide open as written.
So we could have staggered evergreens and have the other things incorporated as well and accomplish more separation and a wider landscape buffer with the other trees.
I just don't know what advantage shrubs in a lot of cases are giving you from a height perspective. Deciduous material is questionable because it's going to help you a portion of the year, but not others.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky.
I mean, I like the idea of the staggered evergreens to give us the opacity that we need, but I think that also to make it more visually appealing, so it's not evergreens, I think other plantings around it are helpful. That's my opinion, and
You have a lot of evergreen bushes. There's a lot of evergreen bushes.
Gotcha. So yeah, if
So
you're
maybe
talking
some
about
in
incorporating,
front of the evergreens, and then behind the evergreens, maybe the deciduous tree.
if you're talking about incorporating essentially a fairly robust screen of just evergreen and then trying to augment that with more deciduous shrubs and trees, you are probably getting into a wider buffer with
of that, yeah.
beyond, say, 20 feet. Just to accommodate all that. But that's getting really expensive, I'll be honest. I mean,
We're not paying the bill.
at the point that you're
There you go.
putting that much landscape.
And in what other cases is that level of landscaping required?
I mean, the most intense that we have is the double class A, which is again against the highly traveled road. And then completely kind of its, the separate category is the screening for the mineral mining. Those are the only.
And that's a 70-foot
Begin to approach that.
buffer for the mineral. Yeah, I mean, I think that's appropriate.
I don't. I think it's more than,
I mean, that one has the 100-foot wide berm, right, that we talked about. That includes a berm as well.
Right, mineral mining incorporates are mostly for safety reasons.
But that mineral mining area is not farmland, that's gonna be all dug up. There's no worry about losing productive soils or production area with that, so 100-foot berm is fine. When we start worrying about 40 years from now, and this is all farmland again, we've lost 200 feet of width. Is that farm field really even farmable anymore?
I mean, that Queen Anne's County standard you mentioned with a 3-foot berm, 6-foot high, staggered evergreens on it. You know, from a width standpoint, you could accommodate that all within 15 or 20 feet. 20 feet for sure, I'd say.
Does that incorporate a fencing element, that county?
Oh,
Just saying, like, we're incorporating.
You need fencing no matter what.
Right, you have to.
You have to have fencing.
Okay.
Better if it's a picture.
And there was conversation last time about whether that's, the fence goes within that landscaping, or what's part of that landscaping.
I think the landscaping goes on the outside.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Definitely. Definitely.
All right, so I think we have a good impression as to what everybody's thoughts are. And we can talk with, offline with John some more about maybe a staff recommendation, but I think we've captured it. Thoughts on landscape buffer setbacks and separation. So last week we talked, there were some questions about how much property is in ag preservation and how many properties are remaining and so on. Like what's the availability of property? And so what I've got on the screen, and I can zoom into any location if anybody wants to look, but this is a map of current ag preservation. So all of the polygons that you see, and I'll zoom in up in the Tawny Tower area. These are all farms that are preserved in one way, shape, or form.
Blue and pink?
Yes, yep. Yes. Here. So we've got malfeasance, rural legacy, county program.
Just program differences.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so I can pan around the county. We've got more preservation up in the northwest corner and then less as you come down towards the southern part of the county. So that gives you an idea of what property is preserved. I then went through an exercise of looking at agriculturally zoned properties, and I subtracted out all of the preserved properties. And then I categorized them by acreage. And what I did was I turned off anything that was less than 50 acres because that's what we were talking about last week. So let me turn that on. So these then are the properties that are remaining agriculturally zoned properties that are not in preservation. And the colors are, if it's this lighter orange is between 50 and 100 acres. Darker orange is 100 to 200 acres. And then we get into shades of red, 200 to 300 acres and 300 to 400. And I've got numbers as far as how many of those are. Good. So 50 to 100 acres, which is the light orange. 50 to 100 acres. There are 302 properties. And that equates to 21,013 acres. Okay. Between 100 and 200 acres, There are 144 properties, and they make up 18,727 acres. Between 200 and 300 acres, there are 9 properties, and they make up 2,014 acres. And between 300 and 400 acres, there are 3 properties, and they make up 989 acres. So in total, the pot that we're talking about, what's available from an agricultural perspective, greater than 50 acres, not preserved, there are 42,743 acres.
And how many properties?
You're gonna make me do math.
Yeah, sorry.
9, 18, 458, if I did my math right.
So of 458 eligible properties,
Yes.
8 have applied for community solar.
That's not.
So this is
All
All
ag.
ag.
It's not remaining portion.
Do you know the numbers of aggravating portions?
I don't have that
You don't
data
have that.
available right now. I can maybe do that analysis for the next meeting.
Okay.
How many acres was the 200 to 300?
200 to 300 was 2014. And there are only 9 properties that fit that range.
This helps. That's what I was asking for. Because quite frankly, when I think about this project and I think about what it does to the county, I've asked kind of a rhetorical question, which would I rather see? 10, 20-acre properties with panels, or 1 200-acre farm sold out. And that helps us.
Well, which would you rather see?
Not sure. I'm answering. Neither.
And the answer might be different whether you live next to it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Neither. That's the man.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
So just, I don't know if hopefully that answered a lot of the questions regarding what the pool is. Sure.
And again,
Now,
red
can
was.
you lay the
red
ag press
big.
properties onto that?
Sure. Land use. I don't know if I could turn off the aerial. That may help to make more contrast.
Yeah.
And I can turn off the roads. Roads. So the pastels are the ag pres, and then the red and oranges are the remaining possible remaining ones. Yep.
I think Brenda knows the numbers. So you asked about ag remaining portions as a comparison, and while we don't have a count per se, and it's a generalization because we did our best to identify those, we always double check if it's a remaining portion. But we had an acreage, an overall acreage that could be
Roughly 19,000.
19,000, right? So that's an interesting number to pull into this equation and compare.
And
But some of those might-
740 of the acres that you have there before, 42,740 acres compared to 19.
Yes, but what may get a little squirrely there is that the remaining portions that are less than 50 acres. So that number that I gave you, the 42,743, is only 50 acres and larger, right? So it's not 19,000 out of 42,000, it's some smaller subset.
But there could be a lot of remainder properties next to landowner owned
Yeah.
properties.
Yeah.
That's still gonna be the tough one, right?
And not to muddy things even more, but you also should take into consideration common ownership, right? So somebody might have 2 parcels next to each other that are both less than 50 acres, but they might combine them to do a project. So these are not absolute numbers. These are very, very much generalizations.
And there's a table in the brochure that Brenda had made from years ago, 720 remaining portions over 5 acres. is what the pool is currently.
Okay, what was that?
22,827 acres
Oh,
total.
sorry, could you
Say
start?
that again,
repeat that again?
Remaining portions over 5 acres, 720. And that's a total of 22,827 total acres. So that's what's currently, with the code that's now in the trash. That's what currently was on the table.
So that was 5 acres and up, yep.
But I think that the reason that number's more than the one I gave is because it included the remaining portions that had residential rights still left, hadn't taken them all. That means they're less likely to.
So then of 720 eligible ones, you have 8 applicants. Is that correct?
They'll multiply like rabbits.
And
Well,
how
we don't
many
know
are-
that. We don't
We know that.
No, but
Until the
again, we
day
talked
runs
about this last
We're
week. The requirements for solar working on these properties really does limit of the 720, I don't know how many meet that criteria.
And there's a moratorium right now.
Do we have a thought on the acreage that we talked about?
Yeah, and so we talked about 50 acres and that's what I did my analysis on. TJ, does anybody have any thoughts of whether that should be lower, should it be higher? I mean, I personally like the idea of a minimum acreage, and I think setting that minimum acreage higher than 5, which is what it was in the current code, I think it's a good thing, because I hear what Ralph is saying as far as like, the conservation of the property, there's a lot of value there, right? So, but any thoughts as far as 50 acres, 30 acres?
I think rather than a number of acres,
Mhm.
it should be a percentage of the size of the property.
Okay,
So it should be no more than 70, let's say 75% of the property.
so that would essentially allow some of the property to not be in solar and not be in preservation.
Right.
Okay,
There's the math already.
so the idea being that you have to preserve a certain percentage of your property
Preservation. has to be
based on the size of the solar facility you put in place.
Yeah.
So,
Now you're getting down to non-farmable parcels. And then everything else can happen on the rest of that land.
I think we did discuss that last
Yes,
time when
we
we
did.
arrived at where people landed.
Yep.
on that.
Basically, it's a donation price.
Well, we're talking about preservation there, which we talked about last time, but is there,
For a minimum size.
right, but for minimum size of the parcel, is that's, you're also saying there should be, the parcel shouldn't be a minimum size, it should be, if you can get it on this property and still have 75% of property left.
Exactly.
Yeah, just to make sure I understood.
I like the 100-acre.
I like Pat's recommendation because it won't discriminate against property owners that are able to take advantage of it as a way to diversify their revenue, maybe to keep their land in the first place. And I think, Pat, what I think you suggested was not a minimum lot size or property size, but just that there be a maximum that the solar array could take up of the property. And I think, I mean, that to me is the more equitable way to go about it, rather than just saying, nope, sorry, smaller property owner, you can't do it. Only the big property owners can do it. So I think that's a much more fair way to do it.
Shirley, you said that you got 100-acre minimum. Any particular reason why?
Just taking into account the setbacks and the buffers and still allowing, doing all the calculations, it just seems like the smaller properties would have more difficulty accommodating that. The setbacks, the buffers, and what was the other term that was used?
Separation.
Separation,
Okay.
yeah. And then still having a good portion of that going to the ag conservation.
Okay. So
I'll just pipe up, like, the whole conversation about the 50 acres seems to make sense from the standpoint of if you get the rest in easement, you're getting at least what you have in solar and easement. So that's logical from the objective from the Farm Bureau. Oh, yeah. And it's, you know, before it was the 5 acre was actually what was written in as the minimum. So I understand the difficulty with that from a lot of perspectives, but I don't know. 50 acres is a big piece of property. So from a landowner and developer standpoint, that could be challenging. I can see that too.
The piecemeal easement just doesn't work. If you're talking about a 100-acre farm comes in and you only put a certain amount of it under easement.
No.
That's stuff.
I agree with you. I never said that. I agree with you. I
that's
think it's all in on the rest of the easement. The question just is there a minimum size acreage required of the parcel in order to move forward?
I understand that too. Just wanted to keep.
But I agree with you about the easement. I think it becomes very challenging on where you place that and how that looks. So I agree with you there, Ralph.
Okay. Any further discussion looking at? So I think we had consensus, I believe, from last week that 20 acres for the solar facility footprint was the maximum. So no greater than 20 acres. So I think everybody agreed to that. And we've got a couple of different opinions on minimum acreage needed in order to even move forward with the project. So, and we'll document those. So we've got 50 acres, we've got 100 acres, we've got the idea of a percentage. So those are all good options that we can document and discuss with the commissioners.
It's like any add-on, the port gets in the way. I'm still with the class 3 soils too.
Oh, yeah. There were some other criteria also in there. Yes.
Yep. If you uncouple it, then I might have a different opinion on acreage.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask again, well, especially when we have Jonathan here, about the 20-acre total for the solar. I understand now the interpretation is that 20 acres includes landscaping. But if the recommendation is landscaping goes closer to, say the solar site down here, and the landscaping is 300 feet away up at the edge of the road, is that still part of that 20 acres? Because then you're gonna have a lot of dead space. It's not even landscaping, not even solar, not even fence. It's farmland at that point.
That can't be
No, it
farmed.
isn't. No, it is.
Well, the portion
It's
between.
a piece of ground that weeds a grip.
It's farmland that can't necessarily be farmed.
So the question is the landscaping, is the landscaping intended to be free floating away from the actual facility? Is that still included in that 20-acre area as one big chunk? Or are we looking at individual portions, like this section of landscaping here is a portion, and then this section is here, the portion, and the solar is this, and collectively that's 20 acres?
You're saying like part of the 20 acres could be here and part of the 20 acres could be here.
Right, like if your landscaping is 300, 400 feet away from your site, then do you have that 400 times however long that is area included in your 20 acres total?
Right.
If it's not actually part of.
That's the question. 20 acres all in one chunk, or can the 20 acres be?
Or is the landscaping excluded from that?
I'm just saying that's a third.
Well, there's a visual somewhere of a piece of property in the solar farm chunk. It's a pie. And then there's a slice of the pie taken out of the middle of the pie. Now, how equitable is that for everybody considered? You know, so that's kind of just a visual about having it spread around, I think. That's stuck in my head. You don't have to put the solar in a certain area. You're going to put it where you're next to the hookup. Where it fits best away from the forestation, where it fits best in the corner.
If
or
you
wherever,
can.
If you can.
But if you have say a 200-foot separation from the nearest property line for that, if you want the landscaping to be up on the road, you're by effect going to have a big chunk of space that's not utilized for anything. So is it practical difficulty for them to accommodate solar if you have to have, by our code definition, if we go that route, chunks of useless space, essentially?
I'm not following you. What chunks would be useless?
Like this example here, let's say the road, which is here, we move the fence and the landscaping all the way up to the road, and then we have the solar panels inside. well, the space between the solar panels, because the solar panels have to be a certain distance from that property line, right? So that space then is behind the landscaping, before the solar panels, part of that 20 acres, but not really accessible, not really usable. So it becomes a point of,
Why do the solar panels have to stay there?
So I
if
don't
it's a
think
separation
I
distance.
don't think we ever got to any sort of setback, feasible
Okay.
separation or setback.
I was talking about my question out there, we're talking about
So-
20 acres.
Yeah, so, so I think what would, I think one dimension would follow another, right? So we would have, we came up with some recommendation, and we'll work with Jonathan to come up with landscape buffer. And then we'll have to make some recommendations as far as adjustments to setbacks and separation. I mean, I heard what you all said, but with 1,000 feet and so on, but that I think is essentially regulating these out of existence. So I understand that's your opinion, but I think we need to come up with something that's feasible. And so the question is, looking at the other uses, what's a setback that we can make a recommendation on? 40 feet may not be enough, but if you have a 50-foot buffer, maybe a 100-foot setback, it works with that. And now you don't have as much of that space that you're worried about, right? We can look at other zoning uses of what setbacks are proposed. I agree that 40 feet, I don't think is sufficient, but we'll come up with some recommendations on others and not have that huge void between them.
I mean, there's going to be that void regardless, right? I mean, there's still
Yes.
going to be
Still be some
space
There's gonna be- yeah.
that won't be disturbed and won't.
I'm not as concerned because I don't think, frankly, there'll be a big dead space. I mean, why would you do that?
Well, I'm thinking of the one across the street from the next, somebody, right? So the landscaping's up against the road. Now, I wanted to be there because it blocks the view better from the road, right? You want that landscaping in a place where it's functional, because the road's here and it goes like this and the solar panels are at the bottom. I don't know what the distance is, but I would say 300 feet, 400 feet from the road. So we have landscaping up against the road and a big empty space that's designed that way. And then the solar panels down here. So they're designing it that way, even though we don't have separation requirements. And I don't know if we want to make them kind of.
It's hard to do.
You know what I mean?
I don't know what's
in their head. Wasn't your question also here, just the 20 acres?
Correct, that was my primary.
That was your primary question, because now we start to think through, and we've seen this in a few of the plans already, some odd scenarios like that, where we're saying, well, landscaping's here, but your project is over here. Is the landscaping included in the solar area? And if it is, can it be non-contiguous, I guess would be the best word? Like you may have an LOD for a project that is here, and here, and it doesn't all fit into one big shape.
And one of my main
Follow me?
concerns there.
And then if you don't take it as a continuous, now you start to have easement areas where that weave in and out. You might have like a figure 8 easement area, right? What good does that?
Limited
That
disturbance.
is ridiculous.
Right,
Limited
that's silly,
disturbance.
right? That's silly. So you almost have to like
But it
put
against
all of it into the 20, against the 20 acre, right?
What's
We're now getting into nitty gritties, but these are all things that play into.
But I also don't want to limit landscaping, because by effect, that would remove that
Exactly.
section of landscaping you graciously added against your neighbors there, right? Up against it. Gone.
Right. So
And
it's
the
not-
fence across the street, or the landscaping against the road across the street from you, gone. We'll move it right up against. I want to make sure we keep those, you know?
I'd rather abandon the whole easement part of it than to start doing this kind of stuff. You're winding up, what's the point?
Well, right, the point is you were, as you've expressed, but the farmer is looking for the most area of land in easement, preferably, like if we start to look at these parcels, a lot of them are adjoining.
Yeah.
Easement property.
So in the projects you've looked at, Kirsten, has this really presented an issue? Because in my mind, the general rule of thumb is you need an acre of property for 5 megawatts, right? So if we're or no,
Of
no,
panels.
5 acres.
5 acres is 1 megawatt.
Yeah.
Okay, so 5 acres is 1 megawatt, so we're limited to 2 megawatts, so that's 10 acres of panels. But we're saying the maximum is 20 acres. So have you seen that as an issue, that we can't fit all the landscaping and separation and everything we're talking about of 10 acres of panels onto a 20 acre site?
Yeah, so currently, after discussions with Jay and questions with Jay for clarification about the existing code, it was my understanding at least that landscaping is not included in the total solar area. So all these numbers here don't include the landscaping in some
Okay.
cases. So I would say that Chaverton, Solar, Sunshine, that doesn't include the landscaping theoretically, and that would be impacted, and it would be, if they include the landscaping, that's much greater than where we're at now.
Okay,
Same thing with the other one on Fanny Dorsey, and quite possibly most of the others, because currently I think that's Jay's understanding too, that landscaping is not
it's
included.
not part of the 20 acres.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, that's how.
I think it would be an issue if we were to implement that now, these numbers would probably change. Now, I can't do that math. Anyway, so, yeah, those numbers would probably change if we were to include a nice big chunk, including the entire landscaping area for most of these projects, because most of them are gonna be in a valley, right? Because they want the solar panels on a hill, so they capture the sun. So most of them are against the road and down in a valley. So if you put the landscaping next to the fence, it's solar panels, it's effectively useless for 20 years. But if you put it up against the road, pretty quickly, it's effective in providing some screening.
Yeah, but
So we have a conflict with keeping farmland all in one chunk and providing the view shed.
I don't think it's a
protecting the view shed.
conflict at all. I think the purpose here and what the commissioners are looking for is to how to lessen the impact of these solar panels if they're allowed out in the ag zone. So we should be sitting here saying, how can we, if they're going to be allowed, how can we lessen the impact of them so that we don't have these ugly old solar farms sitting out there with a whole bunch of dead trees around? And that's, what you have there, I commend you royally for what you're looking at here. And I'm not saying I endorse it. I'm just saying that to me, that's what we're trying to achieve here. So when we start going into these huge setbacks and all these trees and berms and all that, we're absolutely doing everything that we shouldn't be doing out in the ag zone. That's my point. And we get into the weeds on all this kind of stuff. This would be the ideal if you put that somewhere where it's a non-farmable area. We're trying to lessen that and not expand the impact of those solar. And I don't care if you have setbacks or not. If you have all this setback area and all these trees and everything, now you are lessening the ability to farm that ground. So we're just doing the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, what I think we're trying to achieve. And what the people out in that ag zone, if these things are allowed, I keep saying that, if these things are allowed, I think our goal is to lessen the impact of these and not create stuff that just pie in the sky. Listen, I've seen too many times where all these trees planted and berms and all that, it turns into a nightmare of that and everything else. And it's hard to keep up.
We are trying to
I know
impact
that.
on the ag land, but we're also trying to lessen the impact on the people that are living around these right now.
Well, if that's the case, then your people would abandon farming and these little pieces and dribs and drabs of areas like this. You can't farm it. It's abandoned. It's something for somebody to mow that won't mow it. And it's a habitat for all kinds of noxious weeds that none of us want, including you and your dandelions on your yard, to everything else. And I have to say, you gotta go to a plan B here, that if plan B is not gonna work, which is to eliminate all of them, you go to plan B, then you gotta be prepared to make sure that land is protected and everything around is, not just the use case, I'm talking about the land itself. you're talking about carbon sequestering and all that kind of stuff. And carbon sequestering works best on agricultural land. That's productive agricultural land. I mean, it's a big picture here.
So Ralph, you just mentioned noxious weeds. One of the items on our agenda was weed management. And just throwing out thoughts of how do we best address the maintenance of these facilities? We've explained that essentially it's complaint driven. If it doesn't meet zoning code, then we'll come out and investigate it, and we've got legal recourse to force it. But one of the questions I know one of the commissioners asked was about weeds and spreading those weeds onto other people's properties and things like that. So
I think it's bigger than that. I think it's not just noxious weeds, it's just maintenance in general.
Well, you asked a question, and I'll put it to you this way. The larger the entity, the less they care about noxious weeds. Railroads. You want to see Johnson grass growing out of control, go down the railroad in Carroll County. Now who is responsible for that? So if Jay's group shows up, the railroad says, okay, I hear you. See you around. And that's basically the history of this. So, you know, I'm not saying that I don't have some Johnson grass on my property, but if I see it, I'm gonna kill it. Believe me. But so that, yes, I am concerned about that because the noxious weeds are outlawed. That's against the law to allow noxious plants to go to seed, even on CREP land. You know, there's certain times that you can, and even on CREP land where you can't touch that land, there's provisions in those agreements that allow you to go in and knock out noxious weeds, which you should be doing. So yes, I'm very concerned about that, Chris. Very concerned about it. They're hard to control. It's hard to control, and it's hard to find an agency that can do that. You know, we have a guy, two men that I know very well. Their job, I think they're state employees. They drive up and down the roads all the time with a truck and shoot just stuff on noxious weeds, what they consider. But that's not even a drop in the bucket of what can happen.
Who determines what is a noxious weed?
Noxious weed is something that you can hardly take care of. It will overwhelm good growing crops like corn and soybeans and pastures and anything that you would be growing for unless you take care of it.
There's a specific list.
There is a list
Yeah, there is a
in the
specific
state law. Plants that grow aggressively without natural controls multiply quickly, display adverse effects through contact or digestion, like.
Well, multiflora rose, you know what multiflora rose is?
Yeah.
And here's how things happen.
Lightning weed, hogseed.
At one time, the NRCS, Soil Conservation, encouraged farmers to plant the multiflora rose as hedgerows. They were natural. They could have control until you couldn't control. They're horrible things. So now they're a noxious weed. There was a time when seed companies sold Johnson grass, especially in Texas, as a crop, and they would put hogs and cattle and stuff like that until it overwhelmed the whole area. So that's what I'm saying. We have to be very
So
cautious
there's
about it.
people, then you said people drive around, and so they're trained to be able to identify the noxious weed.
But they're only catching what they can see.
They're along
These
roadways,
sites won't be there, see.
they can't get along railroads, they can't get along places.
See the
you
back
can't
40.
drive a truck to. I mean, it's a concern, I'll put it that way. Now, there are chemicals to knock it out, but that's the last thing you want to
That's
do.
probably what's gonna be growing under the solar.
But
Yeah.
Well,
Chris's
Right.
question is, I keep giving a job to it now. Someone's got to ride around and do this. Who's going to do that? We don't have a staff to do that.
No.
And is that a reason to limit? I think it's one of the reasons we have a limit. But should there be, as part of the approval process, a annual inspection?
Better than that, you could make a tool. Again, I say the solar company, between the solar company and the landowner. You make a tool, this is what you look at, you look at every single item, and that's why the solar company ought to make it and say, this has to be set into the price of the whole thing, and it has to be done on a regular basis. Somebody has to sign it off, bring it into planning and zoning, bring it into development and say, you did or you didn't. No cheating allowed and all that.
I'm with you.
And that's a management, and you do it at least, I would say, every 6 months.
Well,
Annual or 6 months.
Because, you know, 6 months takes you from one season through the other season.
but the commercial solar that's in our area, they have, somebody has people that come in and mow under those panels. They have that, I don't have a.
But what about all the,
But I'm concerned about all these setback areas.
Yeah.
the pollinators you were supposed to put under the panels? The pollinators are gonna be under the panels, or we're gonna be, you know,
Yeah, well, they're not doing that there, they're
everything
mowing,
else.
they're mowing.
They got to mow them down, keep.
We may not be required to.
That might
They
be a
may
big
not be
decision.
We're talking about commercial,
It's not
it's not industrial land. Chain link fence around it and they have mowers.
But I agree, you don't want a no man's land between landscaping trees, a large area, and then the fence. Because who takes care of that? I agree. So I think, as you mentioned, you don't always want the trees next to the fence. So there has to be some compromise.
I'm just back here, so I think there'd be a certification sign-on process.
Okay.
And then a random review or something,
Mhm.
just keep everybody clean.
So how, was this mentioned by commissioners that how it got to be in here? Like,
The
I'm curious how the weeds, because weeds aren't talked about in any other, like,
Right.
if I put a church and the entire rest of my property, like, no one would
Well, it's
monitor.
already against the law. It's already
One
illegal.
reason
Against
is,
the law.
one reason it was mentioned is because it's out in the ag zone. Where
It-
we're
Right,
fighting these
but, right,
stuff
right,
all
right.
the time.
And I get that, so, but how, I just wondered how
It's
it
here
came to
because
be
it
in
was
here.
in
And
Commissioner Bigliotti.
thank you, that's how it came to
Yeah.
be in here. It was one of his points. But again, like, I'm trying to figure out how you even approach that topic when it's.
Well, it wasn't the previous zoning code, the previous solar. Property owner shall be responsible for controlling and suppressing all noxious weeds and invasive plants on the site to prevent spread to surrounding farmland.
Is that in the current text
It's in
amendment?
the draft now, but yes, it was already, yeah.
He took
Okay.
his points from emails that he had gotten from talking to people.
Right,
So there,
I
that's
get
where they came
I'm
from.
just,
It didn't come from.
now I understand where it probably came from, but, and then I'm trying to put it in the greater context of development in all of Carroll County, right? I'm trying to put it in that context, right? And how is that addressed, if at all? Where is it addressed, right? In any other portion of our code? So it was in it is in the code that it has the moratorium imposed on it. We pulled it into there. And I don't know if that developed from a state level down and got put in there, or if that was maybe previous commissioner who brought it up. It got put in there.
Through the process.
Okay. And then would that be included in like a landscape maintenance agreement? Would that be something you would be inspecting when you're out there? I mean, it's in the zoning code, it's not in yours, so, okay.
But it's not in any other zoning code for any other type of development. It would only
Not
be.
that I'm aware of, but I don't know.
Which is,
How do we handle trees? How do we handle the maintenance of trees on the banks, the tree banks? Can't cut so many trees down without replacing.
Well, then
It's the
you're
same-
getting into
it's the same
easements.
issue, yeah.
Well, there are forest conservation easements on those.
There's some lots that don't have, I had a 15-acre lot that I know I couldn't cut trees down, but if I did, I don't know who would ever check on it.
well, you have a mitigation on it. If you were gonna put a house on a.
Oh, if I did a house, but no,
You have a
before we sold that off, we had property, we just didn't put trees. I didn't get the approval, but for the most part, not, know that. It's the same process. as
Yeah,
what we have.
Is that all part of, like a farm plan, which I'm not that familiar with farm plans? Like, do you have to have a plan ban in place for
Yeah,
what noxious weeds?
but not, yeah.
Well, no, I think they just say, why would you grow noxious weeds around? But it happens. But it happens,
Like,
believe
they
me,
pop up like
but
crazy.
it happens.
So,
Maryland
so,
Department, correct me if I'm wrong, Ralph, but Maryland Department of Agriculture has laws that
They do.
require you to control noxious weeds. So you're out of
And
compliance
you
with
can be fined
NDA law.
if you're warned.
if you have
If you
farmland
don't-
or any.
It doesn't matter if you're
Or
a
any,
homeowner.
okay.
On your house, you could have
If you're warned, and you don't do anything like you can be fined.
So that's from
NDA.
MDA.
And I think the guys who ride around and spray are NDA.
So it has a higher level of regulation, yes. Good to know.
Where you grow Johnson grass, you can't grow anything else. And
I
that,
forgot to look it up, I'm gonna look at what it looks like.
if you have an acre of Johnson grass, next year you'll have 2 or 3 acres of Johnson grass. Because the rise zones go underneath the ground. It's not like you just seed it up there, it's rise zones that just keep moving.
Do I have it in my yard maybe? Because I gotta think.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of them.
I'm gonna try you. That's no excuse.
Okay, I will educate myself, okay.
So do we want to move on to talking about decommissioning?
Yes.
All right. So what are thoughts on decommissioning?
Do we know of any that has been, and what did they do? I mean,
Yeah, we
that's
know a
pretty
lot.
quick. Okay.
In
I
within
thought
the
you
county?
In the county?
But no, I'm just on that.
There's a lot of points that have to be covered. I mean,
Okay,
My first question would be, how soon, once you see an infraction, do you require decommissioning? Is there a
I've
So,
seen
Jen,
12.
one day,
I've seen
1
12
year?
and 6 months, 6 months from the time of no
remediation?
generating
Mhm.
power to 12 months.
and I think we had 180 days.
yes,
in our
and I've
previous
seen
code.
4 as probably just under the 100
4 months.
186.
And is
I've
that,
seen 4 months. If the facility does not generate electricity for 4 consecutive months, it shall be considered abandoned.
Mhm.
And then you go, decommissioning could be no less than 6 months following the abandonment, certified by all the things you have to do. And then it would be completed by no less than 12 months from the beginning of the, when it was certified.
Okay,
Help me out here with science. How do they know? How does the county know when a solar array is not selling solar?
Why doesn't the person who's getting the subscription
So it could be-
realize that
it
they're
could
not
be out of
getting the money and
business
they
for
should be
months.
getting? Doesn't that tell you that it's
My
not in operation?
understanding, and Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, that I, as the landowner, if the company decides to decommission, they will notify me.
But
and
that's
then-
before it's abandoned. It could be abandoned for months before they decide to tell you. It needs to be decommissioned.
Is that correct?
I don't, my sense is that the contract between the landowner and the developer or the project owner are gonna have like the details in there. This is gonna be a legal contract that, they're not gonna, if the company goes bankrupt or somebody that owns the solar system, it doesn't mean it's just gonna sit there. That's gonna be under some kind of escrow or bond or something that protects the landowner. Like that's an important, just sort of common sense legal backing for the landowner. And the same goes from the decommissioning process. Like the landowner is not going to be left there holding the bag with a system that isn't doing anything. And that, a developer is still paying land lease payments, even though the system's not producing revenue. So that just sort of general kind of, business law would ensure that everyone is kept whole here, from beginning to end.
so my understanding, just thinking this through, is that this is more of a protection for the landowner, right? In that if you're an adjacent property owner, you're driving by, you're not going to be able to tell if that facility is up and functioning or not. And you're probably not going to care, right? Visually, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. The person that's going to care is the landowner, that all of a sudden the checks stop coming in, right?
But I agree.
Yeah.
And that's why I said buyer beware, because if the entity were to dissolve, you get paid, you don't get paid monthly, annual. It'd be a long time before you realize it. And then the landowner recognizes, oh, it's my problem now to get rid of all this stuff.
Right.
And that's why,
Yeah.
I mean, it's all on the landowner all the way.
But that's why there's a bond. There's a
Right.
bond. for
That is the right
decommissioning.
amount.
Yeah.
There you go.
Right, and that's for the county to determine
Yeah.
what that amount is, and that money would be used.
But that's just decommissioning. There's no bond for saying that you got Johnson grass. There's no bond for some of this other
There is
stuff.
a landscaping
There should
bond.
be in the,
Is there?
yeah,
So-
there
so-
should be a landscaping bond.
There
And a restoration, right, restoration be included in.
Right.
I don't take this wrong, but there could be an incentive when the landowner knows this is going to be expensive and it's going to go over the bond. Sometimes we don't know what environmental landfill issues we're going to have in the future. I like to think science were okay, but you know, if I was a landowner and say, golly days, this is going to cost more than the bond allows. Would I open my mouth
So,
or would I just go quiet?
so let's talk one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So from a non-property owner, from the neighbors or people driving by, they don't care whether the panels are functioning or not, right?
Right.
So solar company disappears.
Right.
Property owner says, I'm not getting paid, or I'm not liking what's happening. They're trying to reach the solar company. The phone doesn't get answered and so on. I would think that the reporting of where it's been abandoned is most likely going to come from the property owner. I don't think there's going the county is not going to know it. We don't care. I think people adjacent are not going to care. It's going to be the property owner who's going to make that phone call to the county and say, this has been abandoned. Then that's when the decommissioning, the early decommissioning will begin.
I agree with almost everything you're saying there. And I've dealt with a lot of real estate. I'm more concerned, and don't take this wrong, because most farmers are very conscientious. But I have seen farmers just say, I'm going to ignore that, goes away. So I don't care about what happens to the public. I care about what happens to that agricultural land.
Mhm.
And their stuff is going to grow up and get out of control and Johnson grass all
Right.
over.
So-
You know, so I'm more concerned about
Mhm.
some way of making sure that both land, I put it all on the land. The landowner has got to certify something. We got to stay on top of it. And fraud, you're not going to write it around. I mean, it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
So I'm sorry, just to address your one point. So
It's agriculture that I'm concerned about.
Right. So if the property starts, if it's becomes
Deteriorates.
abandoned and deteriorates, right? Then that gets kicked to the county by a complaint, right? So either a complaint or the landowner are
Or
going to
an-
notify, are going
part of
to
the
let us know.
management,
Right, yeah. So that's what's going to start the decommissioning process. So I think that's how we get to the decommissioning. So and then Cheryl, you were going to say something?
I was going to say that maybe there should be an inspection schedule in place, not only to assure that the site is still active, but also to update the bond periodically so that there are enough funds for the future to decommission and restore the site.
Is that typically done with the bond?
There is, yeah, there are some folks that are doing
Okay.
that.
So
My bigger concern is as technology advances, that if the panels will become obsolete and we could get twice as, 10 times as many megawatts on the same land, does the text amendment allow for that? What happens then? They want to take these panels out, replace them with, ones this big. What happens then? Because you're saying,
it's the
Well,
same
not
use.
between you and-
no, because the county's limited to 2 megawatts. So let's say on the same land, I can get now, because technology has improved and, this size table of panel produces 2 megawatts by itself. now I can do 100 megawatts on this, like, what happens then?
I think it's a
That's
mistake.
why I
to
say we get
limit
rid of
the
upper limit
megawatts.
of megawatts.
Yeah.
Don't limit.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to limit the megawatts.
But we already put a limit on the megawatts.
That's why I'm.
I'm saying get rid of that upper limit.
They're suggesting to get rid of that.
You're exactly
So
right. I'm hoping
we've already-
someday that you're
I mean,
15 acres.
Our whole world with that.
I think we had consensus that 20 acres was the maximum acreage. But with, current county code is a 2 megawatt upper limit. State law is a 5 megawatt upper limit for community solar, which is what we're talking about. But it's a good point that in 10 years from now, that 20 acres could provide 100 megawatts. So is there any benefit to having in the code a megawatt limit?
Was it said I thought we already said 2. What happens if Carroll County says 2 and the state says,
Well, no,
sorry, you got to do 5?
but
Then
we're
what
talking about
happens?
starting over
We gotta
from,
change-
we're
change that.
rewriting it. So,
We
so-
talked about 2.
right, but what if we got rid of it, said 2 is not, that we
It's
don't
another
have to.
option.
Was 2 set originally because of the size limit?
2 was set by the state. So when the state program started, community solar was limited to 2 megawatts. And so we drafted our code to match that. The state has since increased that to 5 megawatts. Our code still says 2. The option that we're talking about here is because technology will change, is going to change in the next 20 years, get rid of that 2 megawatts. We still will have the limitation of 20 acres. So it's not going to get any bigger, but you may be able to do 50 megawatts within that 20 acres. And I would encourage that. I mean, I think there's a lot of benefit to everybody. If it's already there, why not use the best technology? So I would support getting rid of the megawatt limit.
Yeah, it seems arbitrary. Sorry to interrupt you, Chris, but it does seem the project size, the megawatts, is arbitrary relative to kind of everything else that we've talked about in all the, minutes of these meetings, which we've been primarily focused on preserving ag land and like view shed. So if you could do more with less due to technology advances, great, but it seems like the megawatt number doesn't carry any sort of value, I think, from the opposition side.
How is the bonding? What's the process? We need to increase the bond. Public bankers.
So I don't believe that there are any other bonds that we hold for such a duration that would require reevaluation. Now, in this case, we are talking about 20-year duration. Right, and that needs to be factored into what the bond amount would be.
I'd ask that to be put in writing somewhere.
Yes, yeah, oh, and that, yeah, we would definitely figure that out.
And if I was landlord, I definitely would want that in writing.
And then there's the option perhaps for renewal for another 20 years. So it'd be 3 years.
We don't know what landfills are going to ask for in the future.
And the bond is, I understand, the bond is insurance, right? So you have to, like, the hope is that we never have to claim that bond to county and that we never have to do any of that, right? That's the
Yeah,
idea.
you hope the
You
landlord
don't
can
want
insure
it, right?
Yeah.
But it is insurance. So yeah, it makes sense to look to the future with that. When you initially assess that, right, you were thinking 20 years down the road or whatever, right, in terms of that cost evaluation, which the county does do when we put that bond amount together.
But we don't need public opinion on changing the bond,
No.
right? The county will have the ability to change it.
So
I
there's
saw a
no,
figure that said like 125% over a period of like 5 years. So every 5 years, you look at, are we still within that 125% of the estimated cost? So the bond covers you. And, if every 5 years is not much because, we're moving so fast in the technology, then maybe you have to suggest a closer time frame.
I'm used to bonding, but that's usually a building project or something.
Yeah, but it's,
But this is such a duration that
but it kind of
the
goes
existing
back to the
landowner can't
landowner
grandfather in
being,
on it.
looking out for herself and looking out for her property.
She should, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's-
And looks out after the rest of that.
But what's a recourse if they don't, if you don't have a county code to it? What's the
Well,
landowner's
we can put it in
recourse?
this
Well,
code.
it
that
is,
says
I mean.
It
county
might
does
be in
work
your
with that.
contract, but it might not be in someone else's contract.
And just to go back, go ahead.
Site plan wise,
Yes.
we're requiring the decommissioning plan and the PWA, Public Works Agreement, and the bond. How would we, like, can the reevaluation and increasing of the bond be on a site plan approval? That's what we're just talking about.
So I think that, to me, my thought process is more when it comes through, so that legal package comes through and all of the staff that is applicable to that. So we're not bonding just the decommissioning, right? We're bonding any other aspects of that plan that require bonding. Like there's a landscape maintenance agreement, there might be a forest conservation easement, there might be, and we're bonding for stormwater management, soil erosion and sediment control, right? Like all of the elements that are incorporated to that public works agreement, we're bonding for it. And the decommissioning is specific to this type of use, right? This is the first time it's in the code was when we put it in there, right? So my proposal, Brendan, would be that that is part of that circulation of that legal package, and that whoever is evaluating that we are given, your contractor is going to give us a cost proposal, right? And then we're going to go through and say, yes, that makes sense, or no, you're not there, right? The number is good or it's not good. So I would say that whoever's reviewing that from the decommissioning standpoint is the one looking out, right? Maybe that you're looking out 20 years, so you have to apply some kind of multiplier or percentage increase to that, right? So that is where it would come into play.
I'm sorry, but the question is the reevaluation. So let's say it's a 5-year duration. Let's say every 5 years that the bonding amount needs to be evaluated to see if that still is adequate to cover the decommissioning. Where does that get recorded? Is that recorded in the land records, or is that?
I would think that would be in the language.
So that would be as part of the site plan. So
No, in the code.
Right.
That's part.
But for that project.
But for that project, so, okay, I'll give you an example.
Right, so there's nothing on that site plan that says you have a public works agreement required. That's not on the site plan, right? The nature of the site plan is requiring a public works
Right.
agreement.
So what's the contract mechanism that forces the solar developer every 5 years to come back to us and say, the amount that you're bonding is sufficient to cover the decommissioning? Where would that language exist? But it has to be site by site. It can't be in the code.
Well, if you're proposing it as a blanket statement in the code across every solar project. But that's what I'm saying. I wouldn't revisit it every 5 years. I'd try to project out 20 and just go with a multiplier.
The concern there is, what if you do 20 years from now, your lease expires and they approach you to do a new lease and they put new panels on the post? And then 20 years later, they approach you to do a new lease and they put new panels on the post. The site plan's not changing.
Right.
Site plan's not changing. It's already approved. They can do that. There's nothing to say they can't do that in perpetuity. So what is a bond 20 years from now meaning 100 years? Not to say that it's going to be there 100 years from now, but what I'm saying is the site plan is approved, they can.
And really, you're only
continue to use it.
answering, I mean.
It's just.
We don't know what we don't know.
Right. And the
But
thing
are
is,
there decommissioning bonds for like cell phone towers? I'm trying to think of what else would have a decommissioning bond.
no, we don't.
No.
See, and the other thing is technology can change,
Yeah.
right? So 20 years from now, the cost to decommission solar panels because of the disposal of them could become 3 times more expensive.
Right.
We won't know that.
Right.
So
Or less.
that's what I like the idea of reevaluating over every so often, like every 5 years. My only question is, where does that get documented? Does the PWA, can we put it in the PWA
Right.
and then that PWA exists for the next
So
20
is
years?
there that's a great question. I agree. Is there like a decommissioning agreement?
There's a plan.
There's
A decommissioning plan, so that would be the place to put it, I would think.
That's part of that PWA. Because that's not, unless it's part of the site plan review, which we haven't gotten to yet. Where does that plan come into play? Who provides that plan?
I always foresaw that as provided with the legal package. Am
I think
wrong?
it needs to go into land records because this needs to exist beyond property ownership change and so on. So I think it's almost like an easement,
It's a decommissioning agreement, like a
Right.
landscape maintenance agreement. It's
Yeah,
a
but it
decommissioning
needs to go
agreement
into
that
land
gets
records,
written.
though.
Yes, it gets recorded and
Yeah.
yes, I think that's a reasonable.
Charlie, how is that done at other locations?
I'm actually texting a little bit with one of the developers to, because I'm not sure. This is a pretty deep level for me. So I was actually texting with one of my developers to see if they can give a little bit more insight. But I was asking about so you said that there's decommissioning bond with both the landowner and the county, all three are, parties, including the developer. And I'm asking about the idea of updating it. Does that happen? Is that a standard to do every 5 years, kind of review that? Or not? That's the first question. But then what was the second question? Sorry that you all were asking me.
I was asking in another location, other counties or states with decommissioning bonds.
Yeah, I'll ask that as well.
In agreements, is it, we're proposing perhaps a legal document gets recorded, that's the agreement.
And to be clear, I think the alternative, which wouldn't be as palatable to you, the alternative is pad the bond even higher to start with.
Well, I think it would be.
Yeah, you got a choice, either more review or hit it hard at first.
but
That's
that's right.
Well,
Yeah, I agree, but we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
exactly.
And so we may think that, and I'm making up numbers.
Yeah, if you don't, it could be wrong.
If maybe it's $100,000
Per panel.
for a 10-acre site. Maybe that's it, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think the way you think about it from a business perspective is from an investor's standpoint, and they're trying to assess the risk. And so, the developer, the owner, like the group that Pat's probably talking to at Chaverton, they probably have a third party that's investing behind them. And then Chaverton's saying, well, they're telling us that we need to update this bond every 5 years or review it and make sure that the cost isn't going to go up. So then the investor is going to say, okay, well, then that increases sort of the risk potential by XYZ. They analyze that. So it gets built into the assumptions there. I think in the business world, just generally speaking, uncertainty is not a good thing. That increases the risk, which means it increases the financing cost. So it's, that the more certainty there is, the better. But it's always sort of quantifiable that way, to basically try to get a sense of, okay, what sort of risk should we plan for? So they probably would be planning for the worst case scenario.
I get it. I definitely risk for the investor, but it's a risk for the county too. So
Well, the
it
risk
works
of the
both
county
ways.
is the landfills, and I've read so many articles that say you might as well not even try to recycle any of the stuff. It's the panels or the, after, if it reaches a 20-year lifespan. So, I mean, that is really going to be something in 20 years. And some are not going to last that long for whatever reason. So,
Well, it's
the
been,
county's going
it's
to be
proven.
that totally
Yeah.
bad.
All right, so I think, we've got two options that I think we've talked about. One is trying to do our best to make sure that the upfront bond amount is going to be good for 20 years. The other option is on some recurrence, reevaluate, and at 5 years, 10 years, I mean, that can be determined. So I think those are the two options. What other concerns?
Well, I don't know. Why do we choose 180 days? Now, I come from the world of finance and financing farm properties.
Mhm.
Whatever, if we say you're delinquent for 3 months, we can start foreclosure. That doesn't mean anything because the process of appeal and all that can stretch you out for years. Why do we choose 180 days? Should it be sooner? Maybe.
Well, I said 4
And
months.
I'm with Kristen. I don't care if the public, if the view doesn't change.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But the agriculture and the landowner, I'm actually coming to bat for the farm landowners.
Yes.
Yeah. I would like that notice sooner, but it's gonna take a process, I'll guarantee you.
I think she's.
So I'll just inject there that I did have sort of confirmation that the bond requirements in Carroll County are similar to other counties. So that they're kind of following the standard practice there. And also that the 5-year kind of look to update is also actually standard. It's pretty standard. So I think that that's, already maybe even built into, the practice.
Okay, excellent. So I don't.
Yeah, I just can tell you that it won't be, don't be blind on it. It'll be years.
To me, it's primarily for the landowner, because it's the landowner who's going to say, my check stopped, and try and reach out. And do they have to wait for 6 months to go by, or can they sooner start that
Yeah,
process?
their contract can happen much sooner. That's what the county does. They, you're one page, that's it.
I think there will be some notification if it is going to be decommissioned. I mean,
Right.
that's what we have. I don't know.
So what are thoughts on a different, 180 days was what we came up with, but we're open to it.
I'm fine with it. It's just buyer beware is what I'm saying.
Right,
And I'm
sure.
not talking about landowner, I'm talking about us
Yeah.
as citizens. It'll be a while, that's for sure.
Well, if you change it to 2 weeks for the sake of example, from your example there, you're still talking potentially years of resolution. So I don't know that a month or 2 or 3 months or 2 makes as much of a difference.
Makes a difference.
Yeah.
I think there's a
It does in a way,
balance.
I gotta tell you, you learn the problems, the sooner you do it, and you address the problems.
Right, of course.
Yeah, and with the solar, there's a finality, why is it abandoned? Is it the machinery not working? Is there some problem with money? What is the reason behind that? And so it's not something that can go on and on. It's either fix the problem or
Get rid of it.
cancel the lease and decommission and get rid of it.
Yeah.
And then, force the company to pay for it. Because the problem is not gonna be her problem. She didn't do anything to it.
It will be her problem. too.
Well, it will be her problem, but she didn't do anything to cause the problem.
Well, my point is getting people at the table sooner is better, because you can find a cure, but if it goes too long, it's too.
If you have 100 subscribers, what do you think? How many are gonna be contacting somebody about Where's My Money? Now, is that gonna be BG that's
I
gonna
think that
get
would be
those
BG.
complaints?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where it would start.
So then it would start.
They would notice that it's not producing.
That it's not
power.
correct, and why is it not producing, and do they talk to you? Do
Why
they
should
talk
they?
to whoever is the current solar
If they're
company
providing-
responsible for the
To the
project?
solar provider, they would be.
So
Yeah, there's a process, that in regulations for the community solar program, the subscriber organization's responsible for, fielding issues with the subscribers to the project. But I'll just say that, from again, more just standard that these projects, they only make money if they're generating and they're monitoring their projects. And if something's wrong, if there's a panel off or a little section's not producing like it should be, then they're going to be on top of that, because those are dollars that they're not receiving. And if the only way that there might be kind of an issue with the system basically is if there's something wrong with the developer because they're having some bankruptcy issues, but there'll be another developer that quickly comes in and says, I'll buy it because they want to take advantage of that revenue. So this is it's a revenue stream, and it only works if the panels are producing sort of optimally. So that's entirely kind of the incentive of the developer.
I get that, but one says it's cheaper to walk away. And that's all I care about when we getting to it before people say, I'm walking away from the thing. We've had properties given back to us before. That's a bad thing to have.
Well, if you're going bankrupt though, you're gonna want to at least sell everything or whatever, like a store puts up, like going out of business, selling everything. It'd be the same idea. If the developer's going out of business, he's gonna sell that project to another developer.
We'd be going for days.
Yeah.
Did we come to a resolution about the number of megawatts?
I'm okay with 180. I just want to make sure everybody heard that.
Okay, yeah,
And I am with those.
yeah, we include that as an option to get rid of that. Okay. What other concerns about decommissioning?
Do you need to go into the detail about everything that has to be done, you disconnect it, the old equipment, the conduits, the structures, everything, to what depth do you have to dig? How many feet do they go down to put in the structures? If it's 6 feet, then they have to go down. It's 3 feet? It's 3 feet, so they have to go down.
But that's all in the decommissioning plan,
Yeah.
and I don't think that needs to be put in the code.
Okay, so you just have to have a plan
Yes.
And there'll be requirements for what's in the plan.
for
that
what's
come
in the
from
plan.
somewhere.
Okay, so you make a plan that's part of the code, say reference the plan if you're not going to go into detail.
No, so as part of the site plan
Oh, site.
yeah, there is a quote unquote decommissioning plan, which is basically what is it that the solar developer is going to do when they decommission? And that's going to include things like removing underground conduits. They can, basically restoring it back to the agricultural use that was prior to any of this happened.
Does that include testing the soil? Is
Right.
there a soil
It should
test
be done.
before and then
So,
upon decommissioning?
so that's a totally different discussion, and we can certainly talk about it. From the research papers that I've looked at, there is not a concern that solar panels are going to create water quality pollution. And there's no other use in this county, we put out a survey to other municipalities, other counties and so on around the state. Nobody else there's no other use that requires water quality testing from a municipal perspective, from a county perspective, either before, during, or after any sort of use. And that includes like gas stations, which could be a much greater contributor to water quality pollution. Very much getting into the weeds, but one of the things that we have to deal with as a pollutant are nutrients and sediment pollutants from our NPDES permit. And we're spending a lot of money addressing those pollutants. One of the biggest sources is on the agricultural side. So nobody's proposing that ag farmers pay into a fund upfront to address these things later. There's no other use that pays into a fund or does water, that type of testing before, during, or after.
I'm only saying that because it needs to be, we're saying it needs to be returned to the original condition
Yep.
for the agricultural property.
Right.
So wouldn't testing still be part of the original condition of the property?
We don't test the soil beforehand.
That's what I'm saying.
Right,
Should it be tested beforehand and then upon decommissioning?
But we don't do that for anybody else, any other industry, is what I'm saying. So, and I haven't seen any literature. If you all have found research papers that show that solar panels today, the technology of solar panels today produce water quality pollution, I'd love to see them, because the papers that I've read say that it's a non-issue. So I personally don't see the need for testing before, during, or after a solar panel is installed.
It just, to me, is common sense. If you're asking them to restore it to the original condition, we should know what the original condition is, and then with the end condition.
But if they're
I
not,
think Harford County has some benefits. Harford County, and the stuff that I got was from
Okay.
different counties. This is monitoring after a third-party professional engineer has attested that
that's Harford County, or is that the North Carolina code?
could be one or the other.
The North Carolina code does go into that.
Okay, and it says that you honor it up for a continuous period for 3 years. And they do use the language, including groundwater, vegetative
Yes.
health, density, vigor, and overall landscape.
Garrett
Is that
County,
from,
Garrett County
Garrett
as well
County?
requires, I believe requires that.
I looked at a lot of
Yeah.
Harford counties.
Yeah, so North Carolina, I didn't notice in the code that they did see
Okay,
that.
then it's on others because. So what difference does it make whose county is doing it or what state is doing it? Don't they all
Well,
share the same issues? The same desires to maintain their ag land as it was before? If the ag land was productive, you would have to wait for some farmer to start redoing the land to see how much it was before and and is now. I mean, there's no other way.
The big farm property, we have this with sludge, whatnot, isn't the soil productivity, it's the heavy metals. The
Mhm.
cadmium
That go
coming out
into
or
it.
something like
That
that,
go into it.
and then they can't give that to people who eat food.
Yeah.
Cadmium.
And that's a
There you go.
sludge issue,
It's
yes,
a sludge
which is
issue.
not a solar panel.
Well, you read some places they think it is, but it's, I don't think it is or isn't.
I would love to see a research paper that says that,
We'll
because
see what we can find.
yeah, I appreciate, I would love to see
Yeah,
it, yeah.
it's getting kind of deep, I mean.
Yeah.
That comes into the decommissioning part, I think it's usually when they leave.
So do you have a copy of your decommissioning plan? that you
So
can
that's
send
something I
me?
actually wanted to ask. So the decommissioning plan, I'm not sure Annette and I heard it the same way maybe you're saying, or maybe we did. The decommissioning plan, as far as any of the plans are processing right now, is not part of the site plan. That's part of the
That's
PWA
part of the
plan.
PWI, I'm just.
So, yes, okay, so no, it's not part of the site plan, it's all handled. They're gonna have to hire somebody who's professional and that kind of thing, who's licensed and that kind of thing, to not only draw up the plan, but tell exactly how much each of that thing's gonna cost. And that's how we establish the bond amount. That's pretty standard for any PWA, for any bonds that we're putting in place. You do the same thing for a landscape agreement or anything like that.
So we'd have to go to them to get some kind of, what does the plan look like for
Yes,
decommissioning?
so, and we don't have any projects that have reached that point for them to produce it.
So why aren't they doing it in anticipation of those problems that are gonna happen sooner than you think?
No,
How
no, no.
many?
Our community solar projects,
Yeah.
nothing, with the moratorium was put in place, we don't have any projects that have gotten to that point.
Well, yeah.
So the
Right,
site
so we
plan
don't-
But what's
happens
happening
first.
industrially is gonna happen the same.
The site plan happens
But
first.
We don't have the
It's approved.
decommissioning plan.
It starts
yet,
a
that's right.
public works agreement discussion and documents start passing back and forth. At that time, before they get final release to build, that's when that plan's gonna be done, assessed. We're gonna look at it, we're gonna review it. Well, us as the county, not we as the reviewers, but we'll look at it then, before they get the green light to build. So it'll be at that stage of the process, and what Chris is saying is that everything right now is at this stage of the process, and here's that goalpost, and then they move on to that stage. So we don't have anything right now, and it's a standard PWA process.
And these are site plan, concept plans. These aren't even full site plans.
Right.
yet, correct?
Yeah.
I have a basic question. I know a lot of times we can issue a cease and desist because of health or something like that. What's our authority as a county to do it, to force the decommission, to force a cease and desist? Because you said it right. If it's not generating power, most public doesn't care. Agriculture may. So do we have any authority to say, give it up? I guess not.
No, that's.
After the number of days.
They would get
That's what we would put in this code.
the authority to
Yes.
issue a cease and desist.
Or to come in and start removing it.
Remediation or a penalty or whatever.
That's effectively the cease and desist. If they stop doing it, we'll come in theoretically and remove it from the bond.
Well, again, my issue is just getting it back to production,
Yeah.
the land, don't let it go unproduced.
Yeah.
So electricity or vegetables.
I know we're running out of time here, so I was just wondering if you are going to recap and capture, make sure we captured all the opinions like you did last week, right? You went over all of the items and just kind of what the different opinions were, so just to make sure that you've documented everything.
We weren't planning on doing that today, but certainly before we present anything to the commissioners, we will have one final complete document that we'll all be going through to make sure that we do that one last time.
Okay, and I know you have other on here, which I know we're not getting to today, but there are a couple of things I'd like to add to other.
Sure.
I can email them or you can add them here, but lighting is one, and somebody did briefly touch on lighting, but I saw that in some other codes, so maybe that is something we need to look at, and we talked about like motion. So maybe there are times when maintenance needs to be done, or they need to come into the area to do something, and then, so with lighting that doesn't stay on all the time, and no lighting from, and we can talk about the details later, but just in general, like no lighting from dusk to dawn, maybe motion active. Also glare analysis was pretty much in most
We
of
talked
the
about that,
codes.
we talked about that last week.
And so we want to make sure that we get the details of that.
signage as well. There should be an emergency contact posted somewhere. And I know you have like emergency responder, first responder on the other list. So just to include that in there as well.
And just to note, as part of the site plan process, we do require a lighting plan at the final plan stage. So a photometric plan showing where you're putting lights, if at all, and what that looks like at the property line. So if your light is going off the property line. So if there were any lighting to be proposed, it would have to be incorporated into the site plan.
There's no lighting.
I know yours
on
doesn't,
that,
but
I don't
if they
think
were,
any
it
of
would
them
have to
do.
go into that.
And if there was a problem in the evening where they needed to come in with a truck to fix it, they would bring their own lighting. There's no.
I still think we need to have something official.
Sure. Okay.
I'll be sending you some more questions.
Okay.
Brenda knows that. Because I knew we couldn't get all of that that was on your agenda.
Chris, do you mind if I like recap just a couple points too, just because I know I've been kind of in the peanut gallery here and not always necessarily clear on kind of on positions. And at least for one area that we talked a lot about today was the lot and the size and the setback and all that. So I figure I'll just kind of do a quick recap, at least for what I would kind of propose, for the record. There's consensus around maintaining the 20-acre limit. Good with that. I think we can do away with the project size cap because I believe that's arbitrary given the 20-acre limit. Would recommend following what Pat had suggested, which was limiting doing a lot coverage ratio of say 75% of the parcel can, up to 75% of the parcel can be covered with the solar array. I'd recommend an 80-foot setback. So I think that doubles what the current standard is of 40 feet. And that the visual barrier should be within that setback. On the land, we push back against kind of soil type restrictions. We would be glad to kind of ensure that the projects, something really important, this is something we didn't really talk that much about, but we kind of started touching on a little bit, is the grandfathering element here. And so at the risk that there is going to be some changes, we are sort of adamantly pushed for respecting folks like Pat and members for CCSA that have been working together for some time and investing money and time to establish partnerships and to ensure that those that have kind of already put in, quantifiable time and resources be able to move forward with their projects and not be kind of undermined, which is just bad from a respect to the county kind of residents who are doing that, like Pat, and also just bad for business. You don't want to tell businesses you can do something and then pull the rug out from underneath of it. That's really kind of bad form anywhere. But then, we were open for sure to expanding access to the entire ag zone while still respecting that the current kind of ag remainder arrangements that have been made, like with Pat. And I keep throwing these numbers out there to try to kind of give perspective, but if we wanted to limit the amount of community solar development, there's another number. I know I've thrown other ones like 0.1%, whatever, say 1,000 acres. That's it, no more in Carroll County. Have that be a limit on, total ag land. So I'm just throwing all that out there because I know I apologize. I haven't been in Maryland, living in North Carolina now. This was a little bit of a tough one for me to do regularly. And I also appreciate y'all's patience when I was having some issues here to not be as present even on the virtual screen. But I do appreciate being part of the process, and obviously we'll continue having, sounds like, more opportunity for review and input, and potentially more meetings too. But I just wanted to make sure that I at least got a few of my darts thrown out there, for the record.
Well, I'll throw some darts back to the record. I think we're here because of the current projects that have been proposed. So I would propose and like it to be documented that they should not be grandfathered in.
Yep, no, we get that. No problem. So we have another meeting scheduled, correct, Brenda? For-
Monday the 1st, yes.
Okay,
Same bat time, same bat channel.
all right. Very good. All right, I'm going to stop the recording at this point, and we will reconvene on Monday.